I was walking home from work, phone in one hand, reusable shopping bag in the other, when it happened. It was one of those cold but clear evenings in December, the kind where the air bites at your cheeks but smells faintly of chimney smoke and frost. I was half listening to a podcast about productivity hacks, because God forbid I just exist, when I passed by the corner bodega. The fluorescent light inside flickered slightly, making the little shop look like something out of a 90s sitcom. Normally, I wouldn't stop, but I was out of oat milk and I figured, why not? The little bell above the door jingled when I walked in. It smelled exactly the way small stores like that always smell. A mix of floor cleaner, cheap coffee, and something vaguely spicy from the hot food counter in the back. I headed straight for the refrigerated section, doing my usual routine of not making eye contact with anyone. But then, on my way to grab the milk, something caught my eye. A wire rack near the counter stacked with shiny, colorful packets of fruit-striped gum. If you know, you know. That wild zebra mascot, the neon colors, the promise of exactly 12 seconds of artificially fruity flavor before it turned to tasteless mush. My hand hovered over the packet for a second, and then, almost on autopilot, I grabbed one. I don't even know why. It wasn't like I loved the gum when I was a kid. It was mostly an excuse to see how many tattoos I could fit on my arm at once. But there I was, holding it like it was some kind of treasure. I paid for my things and stepped outside, where the cold air hit me like a slap after the warmth of the store. For a moment, I stood there under the buzzing streetlight, the gum in my pocket suddenly feeling heavier than it should. I tore open the package and popped a piece in my mouth. The flavor hit instantly. Fake watermelon, impossibly sweet, like a punch of neon on my tongue. And then, just like that, I was somewhere else. I was 8 years old, sitting in the back seat of my dad's old station wagon. The car had that unmistakable dad smell, a mix of motor oil, coffee, and the peppermint gum he always chewed but never offered. My little brother was next to me, humming the Mario Brothers 3 theme under his breath while gnawing on a fruit-striped tattoo wrapper to get the ink to stick better. We hadn't figured out water was the way to go. My dad was in the driver's seat, humming along to some Dire Straits song on the radio while we waited for my mom to come out of the grocery store. She was taking forever, and my brother and I were passing the time by trying to see who could blow the biggest gum bubble without it popping on their face. Spoiler: it always popped on our faces. The memory felt so real. I could practically feel the sticky vinyl of the seat under my legs, hear the faint squeak it made when I moved. I remembered how my dad would tap his fingers on the steering wheel to the beat of the music, completely out of sync, and how my brother and I would snicker about it in that secret way only siblings can. I even remembered the heat blowing from the vents, not warm enough to fight the winter chill but cozy enough to make the car feel like our little cocoon. The gum's flavor was fading already. Of course it was, and as I stood there on the corner of a busy street, I found myself smiling, not just because of the memory, but because of how it felt to remember. It wasn't just the gum or the car ride. It was the whole world of being a kid, when everything was somehow bigger and smaller at the same time. Like how the car felt like an adventure, even though we were just parked in a grocery store lot. How that one pack of gum made us feel rich, like we'd hit the jackpot because it came with tattoos we could wear proudly for the next 2 hours before they smudged away. But here's the weird part. The memory didn't feel distant. It didn't feel like something from a life I'd left behind. Instead, it felt like I'd slipped through a crack in time, just for a moment, and visited a version of myself that was still sitting there in that car, laughing with my brother, watching my dad tap out-of-sync rhythms on the steering wheel. I could almost see him glance back at us in the rearview mirror, grinning like he was in on the joke, and for a split second, it felt like I could reach out and touch that moment, like it was right there waiting for me. A car horn snapped me back to the present. A guy in a delivery truck had leaned out his window to yell something at another driver, and just like that, the spell was broken. I looked down at the gum wrapper in my hand, its colors already dulled by the cold and the streetlight glow. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling oddly protective of it, like it wasn't just a piece of trash, but some kind of souvenir from a time machine. That night, back in my apartment, I found myself Googling fruit-striped gum tattoos and laughing when I saw all the images. My brother and I used to argue over who got the coolest ones. He'd always go for the skateboarding zebra, while I liked the ones that just had swirly patterns, like they were meant for some kind of edgy 90s kid gang. I thought about texting him, but it was late, and I didn't know how to start the conversation. Hey, remember when we were kids and life felt like it had the flavor of fruit striped gum, too good to be true and gone too fast? I didn't text him, but I did sit there for a long time, holding that empty gum wrapper, thinking about how something so small, so random, could pull me back into a memory so vivid it almost felt like stepping into another life. So now I'm curious. Has something ever caught you off guard and taken you back to a moment you didn't even realize you'd forgotten? Something as small as a stick of gum or as fleeting as a song on the radio. What was it, and where did it take you? So, last Sunday, I had a showdown with a sock. Yes, a sock. Not even a fancy one. Just one of those plain gray ones that come in packs of 12. It was hiding under my couch, doing that smug little, "You can't reach me" thing socks do when they escape the laundry. I dropped my phone and went to retrieve it when I saw the sock tucked way back there in the shadows. I thought, oh no, buddy, not today. Your time has come. I wasn't just going to leave it. That would have been admitting defeat. And if there's one thing I refuse to do, it's let inanimate objects win. So, there I was, lying flat on my stomach on the living room floor, one arm wedged under the couch, groping around like an archaeologist blind searching for an ancient artifact. My fingers brushed it once, but the sock dodged me, slinking deeper into the darkness like some kind of textile ninja. It was infuriating. I shifted to a new angle, got a spatula from the kitchen, and started trying to coax it out like a raccoon stuck in a drainpipe. My cat, unimpressed, watched the entire thing from her perch on the coffee table, probably wondering how humans managed to become the dominant species. At one point, I actually paused to reevaluate my life. I was sweating for a sock, but by now it wasn't even about the sock anymore. It was the principle of the thing. The sock was mocking me. I could feel it. So, I doubled down. I grabbed a broom handle and made some awkward sweeps under the couch, managing to dislodge at least 5 years' worth of forgotten debris. A dead pin, an old takeout menu, 3 paper clips, a sticky note that just said, "Call Steve," and a piece of candy I really hope wasn't a jelly bean because I almost ate it out of curiosity. But the sock? Nowhere. It had retreated to some unreachable void. And then, just as I was about to give up and accept that the sock now belonged to the couch forever, I had a light bulb moment. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a roll of duct tape, and wrapped it sticky side out around the broom handle. A DIY invention worthy of applause, if I do say so myself. With one triumphant jab under the couch, I heard the soft schluck of victory. When I pulled the broom back out, there it was, clinging to the tape like a caught fish. The prodigal sock had returned. I held it up in triumph, muttering something like, "Gotcha, you little traitor." But then I realized something weird. The sock wasn't mine. I turned it over in my hands, confused. I've been rocking the same sad rotation of socks for years, and this was not part of the crew. It was unfamiliar, newer, and honestly nicer than anything I owned. How did it get under my couch? Did it fall from a parallel universe? Was it a secret sock spy sent to infiltrate my home? That little sock derailed my entire day. I ended up deep cleaning my whole apartment just to see if there were other uninvited textiles lurking around. And while I didn't find any more socks, I did uncover several mysteries of my own negligence. A book I thought I'd lost, a set of keys I'd replaced 3 months ago, and a birthday card from my grandma with $20 still tucked inside. It was like a scavenger hunt curated by my past self. By the time I was done, my apartment sparkled, and I felt this weird sense of accomplishment, all thanks to a sock that wasn't even mine. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that sock was kind of like life. You think you're chasing after one thing, determined to get it no matter what, but then you end up finding all this unexpected stuff along the way. Sometimes it's stuff you forgot you needed, like $20 from grandma, or stuff you didn't even know you were missing, like that random feeling of satisfaction that comes from fixing a tiny corner of your world. The sock? I kept it. It's sitting in my drawer now, unmatched but strangely meaningful. I still don't know where it came from, but it feels like a little trophy. A reminder that even when things seem pointless, like crawling around on your stomach to retrieve a rogue piece of clothing, there's usually something worthwhile hiding under the surface. Or under the couch. So, now I'm curious. What's the most random thing that ever led you to an unexpected win? Or, a sock. Sometimes I feel like my memories from childhood are alive, like little fireflies trapped in jars, glowing faintly in the dark corners of my mind. I don't always think about them, but every now and then, something shakes the jars loose. A smell, a sound, or even just the way the light hits a room, and suddenly I'm there again, in a place I thought I'd left behind. I can still hear the rattle of my grandpa's old Ford pickup as it crawled down the gravel driveway toward his house. It was one of those rust-bitten things that seemed held together by sheer willpower and duct tape. But to me, it was a chariot. The cab smelled like motor oil and sun-warmed vinyl, and the dashboard was littered with little tokens of his life. Spare change, crumpled receipts, and a fading photograph of my grandma tucked behind the cracked visor. I remember how I'd sit in the passenger seat, bouncing just a little with every pothole, pretending I was on some grand expedition while he hummed an old country song under his breath. His house was small and kind of lopsided, leaning ever so slightly like it might one day give up and take a nap. But the backyard? That was magic. It stretched out endlessly, or at least it felt that way, with an orchard on one side and a creek on the other. There was an old rope swing tied to the biggest tree, and if you launched yourself off it just right, you'd fly out over the creek for a split second before letting go and plunging into the cold water. I wasn't brave enough to try it most days, but when I did, that moment of freefall felt like I could touch the sky. Sometimes, when the weather was just right, we'd sit out by the creek with a couple of fishing poles. I never cared much about catching anything. It was more about the waiting, the quiet, the way the water shimmered under the afternoon sun and the dragonflies hovered like tiny helicopters over the reeds. Grandpa had this knack for telling stories, the kind that didn't sound like stories at first because he told them so matter-of-factly. Like the one about the time he found a bottle on the beach with a message inside, or the night he swore he saw a UFO out by the old barn. I never knew how much of it was true, but it didn't matter. The way he told them made them true enough. On rainy days, when the creek was swollen and muddy, we'd retreat inside. He'd let me rummage through the big wooden chest in the corner of the living room, the one filled with odd little treasures, vintage postcards, smooth stones, a compass that didn't point north. I'd spend hours sifting through it, making up my own stories for where everything came from. My favorite was a brass key with no lock to fit, which I was convinced must have belonged to some long-lost treasure chest. Grandpa never corrected me, just grinned and said, "Could be, kiddo." When I think about those days, I also think about the smells. It's funny how they stick with you, isn't it? Like the way the orchard smelled when the apples were ripe, sweet and just a little tangy. Or the faint, peppery scent of the old wood stove in Grandpa's kitchen, where he'd cook breakfast for us on Sunday mornings. His pancakes were always a little uneven, some edges crisp to perfection while others were still gooey, but he'd pile them onto my plate with a wink, like he knew they were the best pancakes in the world. And you know what? They were. As I got older, those trips to Grandpa's house became fewer and farther between. Life does that, doesn't it? It pulls you away from the places you thought you'd never leave, like some kind of tide you can't fight. Eventually, the house was sold, the backyard swing taken down, the orchard left to grow wild. But every once in a while, I'll pass an old pickup on the road, or catch the faintest whiff of wood smoke, and it's like the jars in my mind start glowing again. But not all my memories are tied to Grandpa's house. Some are smaller, quieter. Like the time my best friend and I built a time machine out of cardboard boxes and tinfoil. We spent an entire afternoon crawling in and out of that thing, pretending to visit the future and reporting back about what we saw. Apparently, in the year 3000, pizza could fly, and everyone had pet dinosaurs. It made perfect sense at the time. Or the nights spent lying on my bed, an old Walkman balanced on my chest, listening to the same cassette tape over and over. I'd made it myself, recording songs off the radio with a precision that felt almost sacred. I still remember the moment I realized the DJ always talked over the first few seconds of every song, and the heartbreak of knowing I'd never have a perfect recording. But that crackling, imperfect sound became its own kind of perfection. There was one winter when my little brother and I decided we were going to dig to China. It was snowing, and the ground was frozen solid, but we didn't care. We bundled up in layers of mismatched scarves and gloves and spent hours hacking away at the icy dirt with garden tools. We only made it a few inches deep before we gave up, collapsing into the snow and laughing until our sides hurt. I don't know why it felt so important at the time, but it's one of those moments I'd give anything to relive, just for the sheer joy of it. The thing about memories is that they're never really gone. They hide in the quiet places, waiting for you to stumble across them again. And when you do, it's like stepping into a room where the light is just a little softer, the air a little warmer. They don't always make sense, these little flashes of the past, but maybe they don't have to. They're not meant to be dissected or analyzed. They're just meant to be felt. So, I guess what I'm saying is, I hope you have jars like mine, full of your own little fireflies. What are the memories that make you feel warm inside? Like the world is just a little softer for a moment. A couple of years ago, I was taking one of those late-night walks where the city feels different. It was just past midnight, and everything had that surreal quality. Dim streetlights casting elongated shadows, the occasional distant hum of a passing car, and the muffled chatter of people in bars I'd never enter. I had no real destination in mind, just wandering through the kind of aimless melancholy that hits when life feels like it's stuck on repeat. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Nothing was wrong, exactly, but nothing was right, either. I found myself in a part of town I didn't usually frequent. Not sketchy, but older, with narrow cobblestone streets and buildings that leaned into each other like they were sharing secrets. It was colder than I'd expected, and I was kicking myself for not bringing a scarf when I saw it. A tiny shop, sandwiched between a closed cafe and an abandoned storefront. It didn't even have a proper sign. Just a hand-painted wooden board hanging crookedly above the door that read, "The Emporium of Lost Things." Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. Just some kitschy antique store. But the door was ajar, spilling warm golden light onto the sidewalk. A faint tinkling sound came from inside, like someone had strung wind chimes together and let them hum in the breeze. I hesitated. It was late, and I was a stranger to this part of town. But something about that light, that name, the Emporium of Lost Things, it tugged at me. So, I stepped inside. The air smelled like cedarwood and something faintly sweet, like candied oranges. The shop was small, impossibly so, with narrow aisles crammed with mismatched shelves. Every surface was covered with things, trinkets, baubles, and objects that didn't quite seem to fit together. There were jars of buttons, stacks of faded postcards, and rows of books with spines too worn to read. A spinning rack held keys of all shapes and sizes, while a low shelf was stacked with lonely single shoes. It wasn't cluttered, exactly, but there was a quiet chaos to it, as if everything had been waiting patiently for someone to notice it again. Looking for something? The voice startled me. I hadn't even noticed the shopkeeper, a wiry old man with glasses perched at the very tip of his nose. He was seated behind a counter that looked like it had been cobbled together from driftwood, his hands busy polishing a brass pocket watch. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and there was a spark in them. Something knowing, like he'd been expecting me. "Not really," I said, feeling suddenly foolish. "Just curious, I guess." He nodded, as if that were a perfectly valid answer, and went back to his polishing. "That's how it starts," he said, almost to himself. "People always find their way here when they're not looking for anything in particular." I wandered deeper into the shop, letting my fingers trail over the objects as I passed. Each thing seemed to hum with its own quiet energy, like it had a story to tell if only I could tune into the right frequency. A faded Polaroid of a couple standing on a beach, their faces blurred but their clasped hands unmistakable. A snow globe with a chipped base, its glitter suspended in water, so murky you could barely make out the miniature city inside. An old fountain pen, its nib bent at an odd angle, as if someone had pressed too hard mid-sentence. Everything felt alive, in a way I couldn't quite explain. "Everything here has been lost," the old man said from behind me, as if reading my thoughts. "Things people left behind, forgot about, or let slip through the cracks. Some come here looking to reclaim them. Others just stumble in, like you. And what happens if no one comes for them? I asked. He smiled faintly. Then they stay here, waiting, until someone finds a use for them again. I picked up a tarnished locket from a nearby shelf, the kind with a tiny clasp you had to pry open with your fingernail. Inside was a black and white photo of a woman with a serious face and soft eyes. She looked like she might have been someone's mother, or sister, or maybe just a stranger who'd sat for a photograph a lifetime ago. Who decides what gets to be found again? I asked, more to myself than to him. Sometimes the world does, he said. Sometimes you do. I didn't know what to make of that, but something about the locket felt, right? Like it had been waiting for me. How much? I asked, holding it up. The old man waved his hand dismissively. Take it, he said. If it's yours, you'll know what to do with it. It wasn't until I got home that I realized the locket wasn't empty. Tucked behind the photo, folded so small it was nearly invisible, was a slip of paper. When I unfolded it, I found a single line written in spidery, looping handwriting. The key is in the garden. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. What garden? What key? I don't even have a garden, I thought, annoyed at myself for being so intrigued by something so cryptic. But the locket stayed on my nightstand, and every time I glanced at it, I felt the weight of that note tugging at me. A few days later, I went for another walk, more out of habit than anything else. It had rained earlier, and the streets were slick and shining under the pale glow of the streetlights. As I rounded a corner, I saw it. A little community garden I must have passed 100 times without noticing. It wasn't much, just a patch of raised beds surrounded by a chain-link fence. But something about it stopped me in my tracks. Inside, I spotted a low stone bench, its surface worn smooth with age. Sitting on it, as if it had been placed there just for me, was a single brass key. It was old and heavy, the kind you'd expect to find in a Victorian mansion, and it fit perfectly in the palm of my hand. I never figured out what the key was meant for. It's sitting in a drawer now, next to the locket and the note, but every time I look at it, I feel that same strange sense of possibility. Like the world was reminding me that sometimes things don't need to make sense to be meaningful. Sometimes you just have to let the mystery be. Have you ever had a moment where it felt like the world was nudging you, telling you to pay attention? A little wink, just for you? The day began with a smudge. A bird had left its mark on my bedroom window, and the sheer absurdity of it, a perfect little white splatter, was the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes. Normally, this would annoy me, but today it struck me as funny. A ridiculous blessing, maybe. A sign to not take myself so seriously. So I laughed, swung my legs out of bed, and decided I wasn't going to waste the strange energy humming under my skin. The city felt different that morning, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the way the clouds hung low, soft and silvery, like they'd paused just long enough to give the earth a chance to breathe. Or maybe it was the faint smell of rain mixing with coffee and pavement. I had no agenda, no responsibilities calling my name, just a curious pull to step outside and find something. What exactly, I didn't know. I grabbed my coat and stepped out. The first twist in my day came from a flyer taped to a lamppost. It was handwritten in thick, looping letters. Help needed at the market. Come as you are. Bring good vibes. There was no phone number, no address, just a cartoonish arrow pointing down the street toward the old train depot. It was so absurd that I couldn't resist. Something about those words, come as you are, felt personal, like they were meant for me. The market wasn't what I expected. There were no neatly organized booths or hipsters selling artisan candles. Instead, it was chaotic and alive. A maze of mismatched tints and carts, spilling over with things that felt plucked out of someone's imagination. A woman with glittering silver hair sold jars of what she called moonlight honey, and as I passed, she leaned close and whispered, "Careful, it's addictive." A man balanced precariously on a ladder, painting swirling galaxies on the side of a food truck. Somewhere, a child's laughter rang out like a bell, though I couldn't see where it was coming from. At the heart of the market stood an old man in a top hat, pacing in front of a booth piled high with books. "You!" he called out as I wandered closer, his voice cutting through the din. He pointed at me with a wooden cane that had a silver fox head for a handle. Are you the help I've been waiting for? I froze. Me? Yes, you, he said, exasperated, as if I were the one who had put up the cryptic flyer. I need someone with sharp eyes and quick feet. Can you manage that? I didn't know what I was agreeing to, but something in me said yes. Sure. What do you need? He thrust a small, battered notebook into my hands. Take this. There are 5 names written inside. Find them before the market closes and bring them to me. Simple enough, isn't it? He winked, though his eyes were sharp and glinting. Before I could ask a single question, he turned away and disappeared into the crowd. The first name in the notebook was Dahlia. That's all it said. No last name, no description. Just Dahlia. It felt like the beginning of a scavenger hunt, but there was no prize at the end, just a lingering sense that this was important somehow. So I walked deeper into the market, letting instinct guide me. I found Dahlia in a corner tent filled with birds, canaries, finches, a majestic parrot perched on her shoulder. She was young, with a wild mane of curls and a necklace made of feathers. When I asked if she was Dahlia, she smiled like she'd been expecting me. So he sent you, huh? She said, handing me a small vial filled with something amber-colored. Take this. He'll know what to do with it. I wanted to ask questions, how she knew the man in the top hat, what was in the vial, but she waved me off with a flourish of her hand, already turning her attention back to a finch trying to escape its cage. Go on, you've got more to find, she said, and that was that. The second name was Ezra, and I found him at a cart selling clocks. He was ancient, his hands as weathered as driftwood, and his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't have much time left, he said, placing an ornate pocket watch into my palm. It was warm, as if it had been ticking in the sun. Give this to him, and tell him not to waste it. The names led me all over the market. A tattoo artist named Soul gave me a sketch of a key, its lines so intricate I swore it could unlock something. An older woman named Miriam handed me a folded paper crane, her eyes glassy as she said, "It carries a wish." And finally, I found a boy named Leo, no older than 10, standing on tiptoe to reach the counter of a candy stand. He gave me a smooth, flat stone, etched with what looked like constellations. He'll understand, Leo said solemnly, and ran off before I could say another word. By the time I returned to the old man, the sun was dipping low, painting the market in hues of gold and rose. He stood exactly where I'd left him, as if he hadn't moved an inch all day. Well, he asked, raising an eyebrow. I handed him the objects one by one. The vial, the watch, the sketch, the crane, the stone. He examined each with the care of someone reading an ancient text, nodding slightly to himself. When he finished, he looked up at me, his expression unreadable. You've done well, he said. Better than most. What is all this for? I asked, the weight of the day suddenly hitting me. Why me? He smiled, a small, secretive thing. Because you were curious enough to follow the thread, and because you needed a reminder. A reminder of what? He leaned in close, his eyes piercing. That the world is full of stories waiting to be found. You just have to look for them. Before I could respond, he tapped his cane twice on the ground, and the air around him seemed to shimmer. I blinked, and he was gone. The market, too, began to dissolve, the tents and carts folding into the twilight as if they'd never been there. By the time I reached the street, there was nothing left but silence and the faint smell of rain. I walked home with the notebook still in my hand. When I opened it, the names had disappeared, replaced by a single sentence scrawled in looping handwriting. The magic is always closer than you think. I was standing in the toothpaste aisle at the grocery store, holding 2 nearly identical boxes of whitening toothpaste, frozen in existential crisis. One promised diamond bright shine, while the other boasted radiant sparkle, and for a split second, I wondered if I was buying toothpaste or trying out for a toothpaste commercial. I glanced at the guy next to me, who was holding a box of floss and looked equally perplexed, and we shared a moment of silent understanding. Modern life had somehow made even brushing your teeth into a branding exercise. I put both boxes back and reached for the store brand. As I tossed it into my cart, I caught sight of my phone buzzing in the cup holder like a needy pet. The notification read, "Take a deep breath. You've got this." It was from some mindfulness app I downloaded months ago in a fit of optimism but had forgotten to unsubscribe from. At first, I rolled my eyes, but then I did it. Just one deep breath. And you know what? It actually worked. For a moment, I felt calm in the fluorescent chaos of the supermarket. Then the app pinged again. Celebrate your win with a moment of gratitude. So now, apparently, my phone thinks I need to be congratulated for breathing. Perfect. But as I wheeled my cart toward the cereal aisle, I started to notice all the strange little things we've normalized in our daily routines. Like how every box of cereal now has to feel like a party invitation. Funfetti blast, chocolate carnival, berry explosion. It's as if plain old cornflakes just packed up and left town. There was even one with a QR code on the front to unlock exclusive adventures in some game app. I wondered if anyone ever actually scanned those. And when did breakfast become so gamified? Back in my apartment, the first thing I did was ask my smart speaker to play some music while I unpacked my groceries. It obligingly started up a playlist called Chill Vibes for Unpacking. How did it know? I didn't even realize that was a vibe. But there it was, perfectly curated for my exact situation, with acoustic covers of pop songs and a sprinkle of lo-fi beats. Halfway through putting away the eggs, I caught myself swaying to the music and laughing. My entire life now had a soundtrack, and the wild part was that I liked it. I think the moment things got truly weird was when my refrigerator sent me a text. "You're low on oat milk," it said, complete with a little sad face emoji. I stared at the message, trying to decide if I was impressed or alarmed. On one hand, this was helpful. Oat milk was definitely on the decline. On the other, I wasn't sure how I felt about being guilt-tripped by my own appliances. What's next? My toaster telling me to stop eating so many bagels? My vacuum lecturing me about the state of my carpet? Later that night, as I was doom-scrolling through social media, I saw an ad for a pair of slippers that felt like walking on clouds. And even though I was fully aware that the algorithm had figured out my weakness for cozy things, I clicked on it. The slippers were $39.99 and came with a 30-day money-back guarantee. "You deserve this," the ad whispered. And honestly, I believed it. I added them to my cart and felt an immediate rush of dopamine, as if buying slippers online had somehow validated my entire existence. But the real kicker came the next morning. I woke up to an email from the slipper company that said, "Welcome to the cozy family. Your slippers are on their way, and we're so excited for you to experience true comfort." It was both hilarious and oddly heartwarming. These people didn't just want to sell me slippers, they wanted me to feel like I belonged to their family of slipper enthusiasts. And for a second, I kind of did. That's the thing about life these days. It's full of these tiny, ridiculous moments that are so specific to our modern world. Like when your coffee machine cheerfully announces it's descaling itself, or when your phone reminds you to drink water like it's your overprotective best friend. Or the way every product you buy comes with an invitation to join some kind of loyalty program, like we're all members of a million secret clubs we never asked to join. Even our humor has shifted into this strange, delightful space. I mean, we've reached a point where entire conversations can be held in reaction GIFs. Just the other day, my friend sent me a picture of a baby goat wearing sunglasses, and I replied with a GIF of a raccoon doing jazz hands. No words. And yet, it was one of the most meaningful interactions I'd had all week. Sometimes, it feels like we're all just bumbling our way through this digital maze, finding joy in the little absurdities that pop up along the way. Like how I'll spend 15 minutes crafting the perfect reply to a group text, only for someone to respond with a single thumbs-up emoji. Or how my calendar app now gives me a motivational quote every morning, even though I never asked for one. Today's was, "You don't have to be perfect to be amazing." Thanks, Google Calendar. I'll try to remember that next time I'm debating toothpaste brands. As I sat there, sipping my oat milk latte and waiting for my cloud-like slippers to arrive, I realized how much I genuinely love these quirky little details of modern life. Sure, they're a little ridiculous, but they're also kind of beautiful in their own way. They remind me that life doesn't have to be so serious all the time. It can be silly, playful, and a little weird, and that's what makes it fun. So now I'm curious. What's the quirkiest little thing about today's world that makes you smile? It started with a wrong turn, as the best adventures usually do. I was supposed to be heading to a boring work conference 3 hours away. Just me, my trusty GPS, and a presentation about sales funnels that I wasn't entirely sure I understood. But somewhere outside a little town called Maple Glen, my phone lost service, and my GPS threw in the towel. I was left with nothing but winding roads, a tank that was a quarter full, and a vague sense that this was how people ended up on true crime podcasts. After about 30 minutes of stubbornly refusing to stop for directions, I found myself driving through a tunnel of trees so dense they swallowed the sunlight. The road was so narrow I wondered if I'd accidentally veered onto someone's private property. That's when I saw it, a weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree, the words Pine Hollow Fall Festival, 1 mile ahead, painted in looping, faded letters. My first thought was, who throws a festival in the middle of nowhere? My second thought was, this is how horror movies begin. Still, I figured I could ask someone for directions, so I followed the road until it opened into a clearing. The scene before me was like something out of a dream, or a very elaborate Instagram post. String lights zigzagged between trees, glowing softly against the twilight. Booths lined the clearing, selling everything from homemade pies to candles carved into the shapes of woodland animals. Kids ran around with caramel apples, and a man on stilts casually walked past like that was a normal thing to do on a Tuesday. The air smelled like cider and cinnamon, and somewhere in the distance, a band was playing a Johnny Fiddle tune. I parked my car near a line of hay bales and stepped out, feeling like I'd fallen through a portal into a small-town fairy tale. A woman wearing an apron covered in flower smudges noticed me gawking and waved me over to her booth. "First time at the festival?" she asked, sliding a tiny pumpkin pie across the counter toward me. "On the house. Everyone gets a freebie their first year." I didn't have the heart to explain that I was just a lost city dweller trying to find my way back to a soul-crushing conference room, so I took the pie and nodded. It was still warm, the crust buttery and flaky in a way that made me want to cry a little. I was so distracted by its perfection that I didn't notice someone approaching until they spoke. "You must be new. You've got that wide-eyed what is this place look," said a man about my age, grinning as he leaned against the counter. He was tall, with messy blonde hair, a denim jacket, and the kind of smile that could talk you into doing something stupid. He introduced himself as Rowan and said he helped organize the festival every year. Before I could explain my accidental arrival, he handed me a mason jar filled with what he claimed was the best apple cider I'd ever tasted. Spoiler, he wasn't lying. I told him I was just passing through, but he shook his head like that was impossible. "Nobody just stumbles on Pine Hollow," he said with a wink. "If you're here, it's because you're supposed to be." I laughed it off, but there was something about the way he said it that gave me goosebumps. Before I knew it, he was dragging me to try the candied pecans at one booth, the hand-pressed pumpkin ravioli at another. Everything was incredible, the kind of food that makes you wonder if you've been living your whole life wrong. Rowan seemed to know everyone, stopping to chat with a man selling hand-carved birdhouses, a group of elderly women knitting scarves, and a teenager who painted landscapes so beautiful they didn't look real. As the sun sank lower, Rowan pulled me toward the bonfire at the center of the clearing. People gathered around, some singing along to a guitarist strumming a mournful tune, others wrapped in blankets and sipping cider. A girl no older than 7 walked up and offered me a marshmallow on a stick without saying a word. Her tiny face solemn like this was some kind of sacred rite. I roasted it until it was golden and gooey, and for a moment, everything felt timeless. Perfect, even. Rowan told me stories about the festival, how it had started decades ago as a harvest celebration. He spoke about it with so much love it almost hurt to listen. When I asked him why the festival wasn't advertised, he just shrugged. "We don't need to be found," he said. "The right people always find us." The night blurred into magic after that. There was a lantern-lit maze made from corn stalks where I got lost for what felt like hours but didn't mind. Rowan and I raced down a hill in burlap sacks like kids, laughing until our sides hurt. A group of strangers invited me into a game of tug-of-war, which ended with half of us sprawled in the mud, grinning like idiots. And then there was the dance, a makeshift wooden floor under the stars where the fiddler from earlier played fast, joyful songs that felt like they belonged in another century. Rowan spun me in dizzying circles, and for the first time in years, I didn't care if I looked ridiculous. At some point, long after midnight, I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. When I finally pulled it out, it was still useless. No signal, no notifications, no clock. It was like the outside world didn't exist. I thought about the conference I'd been so worried about and realized I couldn't remember why it had seemed so important. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up in my car, parked in the same spot near the hay bales. The festival was gone. No booths, no bonfire, no lanterns. Just an empty clearing and the faintest scent of cinnamon in the air. For a moment, I thought I dreamed the whole thing, but then I noticed a mason jar sitting on the passenger seat. It was filled with cider, and tied to it was a piece of twine with a note that read, "See you next year." I didn't make it to the conference. I didn't even care. I drove home with a smile on my face and the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. Every fall since, I've tried to find Pine Hollow again, but I never have. Part of me wonders if it's even real, but another part of me knows it doesn't matter. Have you ever stumbled into something that felt too perfect to be real but left you better for it? Yesterday started like any other day. Alarm clock blaring, my dog Moose enthusiastically licking my ear, and me questioning why I stayed up until 2 a.m. watching conspiracy theory videos. But then, as I groggily dragged myself to the bathroom, I opened the door and stepped into, well, not my bathroom. Gone was my toothpaste, speckled mirror, and half-empty shampoo bottles. Instead, I was standing in what looked like a massive library, the kind you only see in movies or billionaires' homes. Books towered over me, shelves stretching up so high I couldn't even see the ceiling. Ladders rolled along golden rails, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and cinnamon. For a moment, I just stood there, blinking, trying to process. Maybe I'd sleepwalked into an antique bookstore? Or, worse, maybe I'd walked into my neighbor's apartment again. It happened once, okay? But then I noticed something truly weird. The books were moving, not falling or being carried by anyone, moving, floating gently off the shelves, flipping their own pages, and even stacking themselves into little piles like they were organizing themselves for some secret librarian. Naturally, I did what any sensible person would do in this situation. I said, "Nope," turned around to leave, and walked face first into a wall. Except it wasn't a wall. It was just not a door anymore. The bathroom door I'd come through was gone, replaced by solid mahogany paneling. Awesome. Before I could panic, I heard a soft ahem behind me. I spun around, and there was this old man sitting at a desk that definitely hadn't been there a second ago. He had a long white beard that looked like it could double as a scarf, glasses perched on the tip of his nose, and robes covered in ink stains. He looked up from a book he was scribbling in, squinted at me, and said, "You're late." Late for what?" I asked, trying very hard to ignore the fact that one of the books on his desk had sprouted legs and was now casually strolling away. "For work," he said, like this was obvious. "You're the new archivist, aren't you?" I blinked. "The what?" He sighed dramatically, like I just told him I don't know how to use a toaster. "The archivist, keeper of the great library, curator of forgotten knowledge, wrangler of, well, you'll figure it out. You applied for the job, didn't you?" "No, I just wanted to pee," I blurted out, which was probably not the most professional thing to say in an interview, but I was a little overwhelmed, okay? The old man frowned, muttering something about mix-ups in the portal system, but then he shrugged. "Doesn't matter. You're here, and the library's chosen you. Congratulations." He handed me a key. It was big, heavy, and looked like it belonged to a pirate chest. Before I could protest, he clapped his hands, and the entire library seemed to shudder. Lights flickered on overhead, casting a warm glow, and suddenly I felt different, lighter, maybe, like I'd just drunk 3 espressos and taken a power nap. "Right," the man said, standing up. "You've got a busy day ahead. First, there's the dragon in the West Wing who's been hoarding overdue scrolls. Then you'll need to sort out the argument in the poetry section. Some of the books have taken sides, and it's getting heated." "Oh," And don't forget to feed the maps. I stared at him, trying to figure out which part of that sentence needed the most unpacking. Feed the what? The maps, he said patiently. They get cranky if you don't, especially the enchanted ones. Just give them a little stardust and they'll behave. Right. Sure. Stardust. Obviously. At this point, I was starting to wonder if I'd accidentally gotten into some very strong edibles. The old man handed me a notebook and a quill that immediately started writing on its own. The library will guide you. Just listen to it. Listen to it? Like, it talks? You'll see, he said cryptically. Then, with a snap of his fingers, he disappeared in a puff of smoke, leaving me alone with a floating quill, a key, and a growing sense of dread. The first hour was a disaster. The dragon? Not a fan of me barging into its lair to demand overdue scrolls. I ended up running for my life while it torched an entire row of biographies. Side note, dragons do not like being told they're technically a fire hazard. The poetry section was even worse. The books were literally hurling insults at each other. Shakespeare was calling a modern poetry anthology an insult to iambic pentameter, while the modern book retaliated with, "Okay, boomer." I eventually had to step in and threaten to put both of them in the unread pile if they didn't behave. And the maps? Yeah, they definitely get cranky. One of them tried to bite me when I ran out of stardust. But somewhere between dodging fireballs and negotiating with argumentative encyclopedias, I started to get the hang of it. The library, it really did feel alive. The walls would shift, leading me to the exact shelf I needed. The books would hum when they were happy, their covers warm to the touch. Even the air seemed to buzz with a kind of magic, like the whole place was breathing. By the end of the day, if it even was a day, time felt weird in there. I found myself sitting in a cozy nook, sipping tea that a particularly friendly teapot had brewed for me. I looked around at the endless shelves, the floating lights, and the gentle rustle of pages turning themselves, and I thought, maybe this wasn't so bad. Sure, I had no idea how I was going to get back to my old life, but maybe being the archivist of a magical library wasn't the worst job in the world. That's when the quill, which had been dutifully recording my every move, scribbled a note in the margins of my notebook. Tomorrow, the portal's open. So yeah, that's my life now. 1 minute I'm a regular person, the next I'm running a library that might also be a sentient being. Anyway, if you suddenly found yourself in charge of a magical library, what's the first thing you'd want to check out? I never thought I'd end up running barefoot through a pumpkin patch at midnight, but then again, life has a way of surprising you when you're dumb enough to say, what's the worst that could happen? For context, it all started with a party. Not a wild rager, mind you, more of a cozy, autumnal gathering hosted by my best friend, Lucy, who has an unhealthy obsession with themed events. This one was called Pumpkin Everything. There were pumpkin muffins, pumpkin candles, and even pumpkin-shaped string lights. I showed up with a 6-pack of pumpkin ale and the vague hope that maybe I'd meet someone interesting. And boy, did I. His name was Caleb. Tall, scruffy, wearing a sweater that looked like it belonged to a man who read poetry but chopped firewood on weekends. He had that effortless charm of someone who's never tripped on a sidewalk in their life. We got to talking, and it turns out he was new in town, an aspiring photographer who just loves the way autumn light hits everything. It was painfully cliché, but he had this lopsided grin that made me forget how much I usually hated small talk. Somewhere between debating the merits of pumpkin spice and laughing about the over-the-top fall decor, he said, "Hey, you want to get out of here?" Now, under normal circumstances, I would have politely declined because I've seen enough movies to know how people go missing. But there was something about Caleb. Maybe it was the way he said it, like he was inviting me on an adventure instead of a date. So, I said yes. Because why not? Worst case, I'd have a story to tell. We ended up in his beat-up Jeep, bouncing along a dirt road I didn't recognize. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to sound casual and not like someone who definitely Googled how to survive being kidnapped before. Caleb just grinned and said, "You'll see." 10 minutes later, we pulled up to what could only be described as a scene from an indie horror film. An overgrown pumpkin patch lit by a crooked street lamp. The kind of place where you half expect to see a scarecrow come to life. "This is it," Caleb announced, hopping out of the Jeep. "It's perfect, right?" "Perfect for what?" I asked, staying safely inside the car like a sensible human being. "For photos. Come on, the light is amazing." He gestured dramatically at the glow of the street lamp, which, to his credit, did make the pumpkins look sort of magical. Against my better judgment, I got out and followed him into the patch. He was already crouched by a particularly large pumpkin, muttering things like, "Look at this texture," and "God, the shadows here are unreal." I watched him for a while, feeling a little ridiculous, but also strangely charmed. The guy was genuinely excited about pumpkins. It was kind of adorable. Eventually, he turned his camera on me and said, "Okay, your turn. Sit by that one. Yeah, the big one. Trust me, you'll look amazing." And here's where things took a turn. As I was posing, or rather, awkwardly squatting next to the pumpkin, Caleb froze mid-photo. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what?" I asked, suddenly aware of how dark it had gotten outside the patch of light. There it was again, a rustling noise, faint but definitely there. Caleb slowly stood, his camera still raised, and aimed it toward the sound. "Probably just the wind," I said, though my voice betrayed me by going up an octave. Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he clicked the camera and looked at the screen. His face changed. The grin was gone, replaced by a look I didn't like at all. "What is it?" I demanded, my heart pounding. He turned the screen toward me. The photo showed a blurry outline of something, someone, just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't Caleb, and it sure as hell wasn't me. "We should go," he said quickly, stuffing the camera into his bag. But as we turned toward the Jeep, the rustling got louder. Closer. I'm not proud of what happened next. Caleb might have been ready to face whatever it was like a brave, adventurous soul, but I bolted, barefoot, because apparently, at some point in the night, I decided shoes were optional. "Wait," Caleb shouted behind me, but I was already weaving through the pumpkins like my life depended on it. My brain wasn't doing me any favors, cycling through a highlight reel of every creepy campfire story I'd ever heard. My feet hit a wet patch and I slipped, landing flat on my back next to a lopsided pumpkin. For a second, all I could hear was my own panicked breathing and the sound of rustling moving closer. Then, a hand reached down. I screamed like a banshee. Whoa, it's just me," Caleb said, his face pale but very much human. He pulled me up, and we scrambled back to the Jeep together. The rustling didn't follow us. When we got inside and locked the doors, we just sat there, panting and staring at the dark field. "Okay," Caleb said finally, laughing breathlessly. "So, maybe this wasn't my best idea." "You think?" I snapped, still clutching the door handle like it might try to escape. He grinned at me, half apologetic, half mischievous. "I'll make it up to you. Pancakes? My treat?" And that's how I ended up eating pumpkin pancakes with a guy I'd just met at 2 a.m. in a 24-hour diner. We didn't talk about what we saw, or what we thought we saw, in the pumpkin patch. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it wasn't. Either way, it was the kind of night you don't forget. The kind of night that makes you realize sometimes the best stories come from saying yes to the unexpected, even if it scares the hell out of you. So, what about you? Have you ever had a night where things went wildly off course, but turned into a story worth telling? I want to hear it. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary when I opened the old box. It was one of those brown cardboard relics tucked away in the corner of the garage, its edges soft and sagging from years of humidity. I'd been clearing out clutter all morning, the sort of half-hearted purge that starts with good intentions and quickly devolves into a slow-motion trip down memory lane. The box wasn't even labeled, just sitting there, waiting for me to stumble upon it. When I peeled back the brittle tape and lifted the flaps, the first thing I saw was the tin. It was a round, shiny tin, small enough to fit in my hand, with chipped red paint and an image of strawberries that had faded into muted pink ghosts over time. I froze. I knew this tin. I could feel the weight of it in my chest even before I picked it up. When I finally did, my fingers brushed the lid, and a memory cracked open so suddenly that I actually gasped. I knew exactly what was inside, or at least, What should have been inside? A dozen small candies, each wrapped in thin, crinkly foil. They weren't the fancy kind. The foil was cheap and tore easily, and the candies themselves were sticky enough to glue your teeth together. But I hadn't seen this tin since I was 7, and somehow, it had found its way back to me. The moment I opened it, the smell hit me. Sweet, tangy, artificial strawberry. The kind that doesn't just sit in your nose but clings to the back of your throat. It wasn't just a smell, it was a feeling. The air shifted. I was no longer in my garage. I was in my grandmother's living room, on a rainy afternoon, staring out her fogged-up windows as the rain streaked down in silver ribbons. She always kept the tin on her side table, nestled between the coasters and a lamp with a crooked shade. She'd pop it open with this little flourish, like she was about to show me something secret, and she'd let me pick one candy at a time. The rules were strict, only one, and you had to eat it slowly. Good things, she'd say, wagging her finger, aren't for rushing. I could feel myself sinking into that memory, the scratchy fabric of her couch pressing into the backs of my legs. I could hear the quiet hum of her old radio playing some far-off station, a mix of static and soft music. I could see her, too, sitting in her favorite chair with her embroidery hoop, her glasses slipping down her nose as she stitched tiny flowers onto a piece of fabric I never thought much of at the time. She would hum as she worked, and every now and then, she'd glance over at me and smile. There was one day, though, that came rushing back to me so vividly it felt like I was living it all over again. It had been raining for hours, the kind of rain that makes you feel like the world is wrapped in a thick, wet blanket. I was sitting on the floor with my knees pulled up to my chest, watching the storm outside, when the tin appeared in front of me. Grandma held it out with both hands, as if it were something sacred. "You're going to need one of these," she said, her voice conspiratorial, like we were sharing a private joke. I picked a candy, a green one, for a change, and unwrapped it slowly, the foil crinkling loud in the quiet room. She leaned in close and said, "Now listen. If you suck on it just right, and don't bite, it'll last through a whole story." "What kind of story?" I'd asked, the candy already sticking to the roof of my mouth. "Your favorite kind," she said. "The one about the fox and the moon." She told that story 100 times when I was a kid, but that day it felt different. Her voice was softer, her hands moving in time with the words, painting the pictures in the air. I don't know if it was the storm outside or the candy in my mouth, but I swear I could see the fox padding through the forest, the silver light of the moon casting shadows as he searched for his lost star. I didn't even notice when the candy disappeared. It just melted into the moment, becoming part of the story itself. Back in the garage, I was still holding the tin, staring at the faded strawberries on the lid. I almost didn't want to open it again, afraid that whatever magic it held might have faded with time. But my hands moved on their own, twisting the lid until it popped free. The inside was empty, of course. No candies, no crinkly foil, just a faint residue of that strawberry smell clinging to the metal. And yet, I felt full, like just holding it had unlocked something I didn't even know I'd lost. I sat there for a while, holding the tin like it was a bridge back to that rainy afternoon. It wasn't just the memory of the candies or the story, though those were beautiful in their own way. It was the way the memory felt, warm and alive, like it had been waiting for me in the shadows of my mind, ready to spring to life the moment I touched that old, chipped tin. I don't know what happened to the tin after my grandmother passed. I thought it had disappeared with so many of her other things, swallowed by time and the slow erosion of memory. But somehow, it found its way back to me, sitting there in the middle of a garage filled with half-empty paint cans and broken tools. I felt like I'd uncovered a piece of buried treasure. It's strange, isn't it? The way the smallest things can unlock entire worlds. A smell, a texture, the sound of paper crinkling. It's like they carry tiny pieces of your soul, fragments of who you were, waiting to be pieced back together. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how a single tin of strawberry candies could carry so much weight, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. And now I'm wondering, what little things bring you back to moments that always warm your heart? The town of Bellwater didn't exist on any map. Not anymore, anyway. It was the kind of place that might have been charming once, with its cobblestone streets and ivy-covered facades, but now it seemed to breathe in whispers. The kind of whispers that made you shiver even on warm nights. Eddie didn't know why his car had sputtered to a halt right at the outskirts, but something about the way the engine coughed and died felt deliberate, like the town had been waiting for him. The gas station was the only building still lit, its buzzing fluorescent sign casting long, eerie shadows across the empty road. Eddie stepped out of his car, his boots crunching against the gravel, and immediately regretted it. The air felt too still, as if the town were holding its breath. He tightened his jacket against the unexpected chill and pushed open the glass door to the station. A bell jingled, sharp and piercing. The man behind the counter didn't look up. He was hunched over, scribbling in a notebook with frantic energy. His hair was wild, his glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. Eddie cleared his throat, but the man didn't react. "Excuse me," Eddie said, louder this time. "My car." "You shouldn't be here," the man interrupted, his voice brittle, like a twig about to snap. He finally looked up, and his eyes, sharp, amber, and too bright for a human, made Eddie step back instinctively. "I didn't have much of a choice," Eddie said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "My car broke down." The man studied him for a long moment before sighing and setting his pen down. "Of course it did. It always starts with a broken car." He gestured toward the corner of the store, where an old, dust-covered coffee machine Saturday. "Grab a cup. You'll need it." Eddie frowned. "I don't." "Coffee," the man snapped, his gaze cutting like a knife. "Now." Eddie didn't argue. The machine sputtered and groaned as it dispensed a thick, inky liquid into a styrofoam cup. The smell was acrid, but there was something oddly comforting about the warmth seeping through the cup's thin walls. He took a cautious sip and nearly gagged. It tasted like ash and regret. "What is this?" he asked, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. "Insurance," the man said cryptically. "If you leave here without it, they'll smell you." "Who's they?" Eddie demanded, but the man just shook his head and returned to his notebook. Frustrated, Eddie stormed out of the gas station. The air outside felt heavier now, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. His car sat lifeless under the dim light of a street lamp that flickered like a heartbeat. He tried the ignition again. Nothing. "Need some help?" The voice was soft, almost melodic. Eddie turned to see a woman standing by the edge of the lot, her silhouette framed by the shadows of the surrounding trees. She was tall and willowy, with long hair that seemed to move independently, like tendrils of smoke. Her smile was inviting, but her eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too deep, like looking into a bottomless well. I think it's the battery," Eddie stammered, though he knew that wasn't true. "Poor thing," she said, taking a step closer. Her voice was honeyed, but there was a razor's edge to it. "You look lost. Bellwater has that effect on people." Eddie took a step back, clutching the cup of terrible coffee like a lifeline. "You're from here?" Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. In a manner of speaking, behind her, the shadows began to shift, peeling away from the trees and coalescing into something almost humanoid. Eddie's breath hitched as he realized the figures had no faces, just smooth plains of darkness where eyes and mouths should be. They moved toward him with an unnatural grace, their limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Eddie did the only thing he could think of. He threw the coffee at the woman. It hit her square in the chest, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then she screamed, a sound so piercing it felt like it was splitting the air itself. The shadows recoiled, writhing and hissing like wounded animals. The woman's form began to unravel, her features dissolving into smoke. "You'll regret this," she spat, her voice echoing with 1,000 other voices. "Bellwater doesn't let anyone leave." And then she was gone, the shadows retreating into the forest like ink spilling into water. Eddie stumbled back to the gas station, his heart hammering in his chest. The man behind the counter looked up as he burst through the door, his expression unreadable. "You threw the coffee, didn't you?" he said, not unkindly. "What the hell was that?" Eddie demanded, his voice shaking. What is this place? The man sighed and closed his notebook. Bellwater isn't a place, kid. It's a trap, and you've sprung it. Eddie felt the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud. How do I get out? The man's gaze turned distant, almost mournful. You don't. Not completely. But if you're smart, you'll stay here. Work the counter. Keep the coffee flowing. It's the only thing keeping them at bay. Eddie laughed, a hollow, hysterical sound. You're joking. But the man didn't laugh. He just handed Eddie the notebook and patted him on the shoulder. You'll get used to it, he said before walking out into the night, leaving Eddie alone with the buzzing lights and the bitter smell of ash. So, here's something that's both embarrassing and weirdly charming. Or at least that's what I tell myself at night to keep the cringe at bay. Whenever I like someone, I don't just crush on them like a normal person. No. I accidentally write them into an elaborate, ongoing story in my head. Like, full-blown cinematic universe levels of storytelling. And I mean levels. It's not just daydreaming. It's like my brain becomes this chaotic writer's room, and every time I see them, it adds another subplot or twist to this completely fictionalized version of our relationship. The weirdest part? It's never anything realistic. Like, I'll imagine us getting stuck on a deserted island together after a plane crash, and I'm the one who remembers how to make a fire because I saw it on a survival show once. Or, I'll picture us trapped in an elevator for hours, sharing secrets and falling in love because, obviously, trauma bonds people immediately, right? One time, I had a crush on this barista, and I mentally turned him into a vampire. I'd walk into the coffee shop every day, and in my head, he was using the morning rush as a cover to find his next victim, but he spared me because I was different. I even gave us a dramatic enemies to lovers arc, which is hilarious because, in real life, all we ever exchanged was, hey, medium latte, and thanks. And I know what you're thinking. This is just hyperactive imagination. Everybody daydreams. But trust me, it gets way more specific. If they're wearing a scarf? Oh, now we're in 19th century London, solving a murder mystery in the foggy streets. If they mention liking true crime podcasts, suddenly, we're undercover detectives with fake identities, trying to expose a criminal mastermind while pretending we're just two strangers on a first date. And when I say we, I mean I actively rewrite myself into these scenarios too. Like, if they're into something I know nothing about, let's say rock climbing, I will cast myself as the daring novice who overcomes my fear of heights just to impress them, only to discover that I'm secretly a prodigy and, obviously, their soulmate. Because apparently, my brain has no concept of chill. The fun part? These episodes happen live. Every time I interact with them, it's like adding another chapter to an ongoing saga. I had a crush on a guy at work once, and during every meeting, I'd be half listening to the actual discussion while mentally scripting some ridiculous plotline where we were spies communicating in secret codes through PowerPoint slides. One time, he dropped a pin, and I somehow turned that into the inciting incident for a romantic drama where we'd reconnect years later at a Paris art gallery, both older, both wiser, but still haunted by the love that never was. He just wanted his pin back. I was practically drafting our vows. It's gotten to the point where I don't even know if I like the real person half the time, or just the version of them I've created in my head. Like, there was this girl I had a crush on at my gym who always wore this bright green jacket. In my head, she was this mysterious adventurer who secretly mapped lost civilizations in her spare time. I spent weeks imagining us on some treasure hunt in Peru, solving ancient riddles, narrowly escaping booby traps, and of course, falling for each other under a starlit sky. Then one day, I overheard her say, "Ugh, I can't wait to go home and play Animal Crossing." And don't get me wrong, that's adorable and all, but it completely shattered my illusion. Suddenly, instead of scaling cliffs together, I was just picturing us arguing over who stole whose turnips in-game. It's not just random strangers or casual crushes either. I do this even when I'm actually dating someone. Like, I dated this guy once who worked as an architect, and my brain went into overdrive. I turned him into this tortured genius, up at 3 a.m. sketching designs for a revolutionary skyscraper that would change the world. I imagined him pacing his studio, throwing crumpled blueprints onto the floor while I his devoted partner, handed him coffee and whispered, "You're brilliant. Don't give up." In real life, he spent most of his time eating pizza and watching YouTube videos about unboxing tech gadgets. The cognitive dissonance was significant. What's really funny, and maybe a little tragic, is that I never actually let these fantasies go far enough to do anything about my feelings. Like, I'll spend months imagining a whole soap opera with someone, but when it comes to actually talking to them, I freeze. It's like my brain says, no, we've already got a good thing going here. Don't ruin it with reality. One time, I worked up the courage to ask someone out, and I was genuinely disappointed when our date didn't involve any epic plot twists. I kept waiting for something to happen, like, I don't know, a bank robbery or a meteor strike. But instead, we just had sushi and talked about work. It was nice, but also wildly underwhelming compared to the imaginary dragon-slaying adventure I'd prepped for. The silver lining? These little mental stories have made me weirdly good at icebreakers. If someone says, "Tell me about yourself," I have no shortage of ridiculous anecdotes about all the hobbies I've taken up because of imaginary crush scenarios. Need someone to bake a souffle while explaining the basics of fencing? I've got you covered. Want to hear about the time I joined a book club because I was certain the cute librarian was harboring a dark secret? That one's a classic. Spoiler, she wasn't. But I did discover an oddly specific love for Nordic thrillers. So, yeah, that's my quirk. Whenever I like someone, I mentally cast them as the co-star in a never-ending saga that has absolutely no basis in reality. Is it harmless fun? Sure. Is it mildly unhinged? Also, yes. But it's just how my brain works, I guess. Turning people into characters, moments into scenes, and crushes into entire franchises. What about you? Do you have any weird or wonderful quirks when it comes to dating? Tell me I'm not the only one out here living a whole rom-com in my head while eating chips on the couch. I met Mia in the most unfortunate way possible. She was screaming at a coffee machine in the break room on my first day at work. Not yelling, not complaining, full-on screaming. The machine had apparently eaten her dollar without giving her the chai latte she needed to survive the hellscape of capitalism. Her words, not mine. She was standing there, fists clenched, hair flying out of her messy bun like angry lightning bolts, loudly calling the machine a corporate shill. I froze in the doorway, clutching my sad little office orientation folder, and thought, okay, so this is the office lunatic. Good to know. She didn't even notice me at first, which gave me enough time to contemplate quietly leaving and pretending I hadn't seen anything. But as I turned to sneak away, she whipped around and caught me mid-step. "Oh, you must be new," she said, as if I were the weird one in this scenario. Word of advice, never trust machines. Then she stormed off without so much as a hello, leaving me standing there, unsure whether to laugh or call security. For weeks, I avoided her like she was a human storm cloud. Every time she walked into a meeting, I'd suddenly become very interested in my laptop screen. She had this energy about her that was too much for me. Loud, intense, always ranting about something. The office printer, the temperature of the thermostat, the tyranny of spreadsheets. Once, I overheard her arguing with the boss about why we should replace all the fluorescent lights with warm, comforting Edison bulbs because she claimed the harsh lighting was killing creativity. She seemed exhausting, and yet, people liked her. Somehow, she'd walk into the office like a tornado of opinions and coffee stains, and people would smile and say, "Classic Mia? Classic Mia?" What about her was classic? She was like a walking performance art piece. Meanwhile, I sat quietly at my desk, convinced she was either deeply misunderstood or slightly unhinged. But then came the day she dragged me into her chaos, and nothing was the same after that. It started with a fire drill. Everyone had to shuffle outside in the freezing cold, and since I'd left my coat at my desk, I was practically vibrating from the chill. Mia noticed me shivering and, without saying a word, peeled off her oversized cardigan and handed it to me. I started to protest, but she just said, "Relax, I don't get cold. I run on rage and sarcasm." And honestly, I believed her. We ended up stuck next to each other in the parking lot, while waiting for the all clear to go back inside. I was still awkwardly holding her cardigan when she looked at me and said, "So, what's your deal? Are you a secret spy? Or are you just this quiet all the time?" It was such a blunt, ridiculous question that I actually laughed. For the first time, I realized she wasn't mean, just honest in a way that made most people uncomfortable. We started talking, and before I knew it, I was telling her about how I'd only taken this job to pay the bills while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life. She didn't roll her eyes or give me the usual, "You'll figure it out," platitudes. Instead, she nodded and said, "Yeah, this place is soul-sucking. But hey, at least we have free coffee. When it works." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. After that, something shifted. I started noticing the good things about Mia, the way she brought homemade cookies to the office after particularly bad meetings, or how she'd slip little notes of encouragement onto people's desks when they were stressed. Her notes were always a mix of sweet and chaotic, like, "You've got this." Also, "Spreadsheets are temporary, but your brilliance is forever." She had this way of making people feel like they weren't just cogs in a machine, even as she openly cursed the machine itself. Then came the day she completely wrecked my perception of her. It was a Friday night, and we were both staying late to finish a project. I offered to grab takeout, and when I came back, I found her sitting cross-legged on the floor of the conference room, humming to herself while sketching something on a notepad. Curious, I asked what she was drawing. She shrugged and said, "Oh, just doodling." But when I looked closer, I saw that her doodle was an intricate, breathtaking illustration of an entire cityscape. It looked like something out of a graphic novel, buildings twisting and spiraling in impossible ways, with tiny, fantastical details tucked into every corner. "You drew this?" I asked, completely floored. She shrugged again, like it was no big deal. "Yeah, it's just something I do to unwind." In that moment, it hit me. Mia wasn't chaotic for the sake of being chaotic. She was passionate, about art, about life, about everything. And sure, that passion sometimes came out in the form of rants about coffee machines or light bulbs, but underneath all that noise was someone who cared deeply and unapologetically about the world around her. We ended up talking until midnight that night, sitting on the floor and eating lukewarm takeout while she told me about her dream of one day illustrating a children's book. I told her about my own half-baked dreams of writing one. She lit up like a Christmas tree and said, "Are you serious? We should totally do it. I'll illustrate, you right? It'll be amazing." I laughed it off at the time, but a part of me couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next few weeks, we started bouncing ideas off each other, just for fun. Somehow, between deadlines and late-night brainstorming sessions, we became inseparable. Fast forward a year, and we're sitting in a tiny cafe, holding a proof copy of the children's book we somehow actually made together. I don't know what's crazier, that we pulled it off, or that the girl who once yelled at a coffee machine is now the person who makes my life feel a little more colorful every single day. Sometimes, I still think about how wrong I was about Mia when we first met. I saw her as loud, over the top, and exhausting. And okay, she's all those things. But she's also brilliant, kind, and the most fiercely creative person I've ever met. Turns out, I didn't need someone calm and predictable in my life. I needed someone who would shake things up and remind me that it's okay to be a little messy sometimes. Have you ever met someone who completely shattered your first impression of them? It started with a craving for pancakes. Not the sad, microwaved kind I usually made in my apartment, but the real deal, fluffy, golden, syrup-drenched stacks that could turn a regular Tuesday morning into something worth writing about. The problem was, my usual pancake spot was closed. The sign on the door said, "Back in an hour," but the handwritten scrawl looked suspiciously permanent. Frustrated but undeterred, I decided to try a place I'd heard about but never visited, a diner on the edge of town called Ethel's Midnight Eats. The name was odd, considering it was barely 9 a.m., but Google swore it was open 24/7. The reviews raved about their pancakes, so I figured, why not? The diner was tucked into the corner of a quiet street, its neon sign flickering in the daylight like it didn't know the sun was out. The parking lot was empty except for an old camper van painted with swirling galaxies and a bumper sticker that read, "Honk if you're from Earth." As I stepped inside, a tiny bell jingled above the door, and the smell of coffee and something vaguely sweet, cinnamon, wrapped around me like a hug. The place was almost empty, except for a waitress with a beehive hairstyle perched behind the counter and a man sitting in a corner booth, scribbling furiously into a leather notebook. The waitress, whose name tag said Ethel, even though she couldn't have been older than 30, greeted me with a smile. "Take a seat anywhere. The special today is pancakes with a side of fate." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but when I looked at her, she was dead serious. I'll just take the pancakes," I said, sliding into a booth near the window. She scribbled something on her notepad and disappeared into the kitchen. The man with the notebook caught my eye. He had the kind of presence that made it impossible not to notice him. Wild hair, mismatched socks, and a jacket that looked like it had been stolen from a theater costume department. He glanced up and caught me staring. "First time here?" he asked, his voice like gravel smoothed out with honey. "Yeah, is it that obvious?" I replied, trying not to sound awkward. He grinned. "You'll see." Before I could ask what he meant, Ethel reappeared with my pancakes. They were glorious, perfectly round, golden brown, with butter melting into the ridges like rivers into valleys. But something else caught my attention. Next to the plate was a small, folded piece of paper. I looked up at Ethel, confused. "Part of the special," she said with a wink before walking away. I unfolded the paper. Written in delicate, looping handwriting were the words, "Go to the train station. Don't think. Just go." My first instinct was to laugh it off. Some gimmick, I thought. But as I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that the note was meant for me. Maybe it was the man's cryptic grin or the way Ethel's words lingered in my head. Or maybe it was just the pancakes. They tasted so absurdly good. They felt like a sign from the universe. 15 minutes later, I found myself standing at the town's tiny train station. It wasn't a place I ever thought about, just a relic from a time when people still used trains to get anywhere. But as I stood there, unsure of what I was supposed to do, a train pulled in. It wasn't on any schedule I'd seen, and it didn't look like it belonged in the modern world. Its cars were painted in deep, jewel tones, emerald green, sapphire blue, ruby red, and the windows glowed softly, as if lit from within by candlelight. The doors slid open with a whisper, and before I could second-guess myself, I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and something smoky, like a campfire. The interior was even stranger. Plush velvet seats, brass fixtures, and lanterns swaying gently from the ceiling. There were only a handful of passengers, each as peculiar as the man from the diner. A woman in a Victorian dress was flipping through a book with no visible title. A boy with shockingly silver hair held a jar filled with fireflies. And at the far end of the car, an old man in a cloak appeared to be playing chess against himself. I took a seat near the window, unsure of what I'd gotten myself into. A voice crackled over the intercom, rich and theatrical. "Welcome aboard the Timekeeper Express. All passengers, please fasten your sense of disbelief and prepare for departure." I felt the train begin to move, but when I looked out the window, the station wasn't receding into the distance. Instead, the landscape outside was shifting. Trees dissolving into desert, mountains melting into rolling fields, then into oceans that sparkled under a sky full of unfamiliar constellations. "First time?" The question came from the boy with the fireflies, who had taken the seat across from me. "Is it that obvious?" I asked, echoing my words from the diner. He smiled. "You'll get used to it. The train likes to pick up new passengers when they're at a crossroads." "A crossroads?" "You know," he said, gesturing vaguely with the jar, "when life feels stuck, like you're meant for something more but don't know what it is yet." I wanted to argue, to say that I was perfectly fine with my boring, pancake-filled life, but the words wouldn't come. He was right, and we both knew it. The train stopped twice. Once at a bustling marketplace that seemed to float in the clouds, where merchants sold things like bottled starlight and maps to forgotten worlds. The second stop was a lush, overgrown forest, where a woman boarded carrying a basket of glowing mushrooms. Each time, the passengers greeted the newcomers like old friends, and each time, I stayed in my seat, watching, wondering. Finally, the boy stood and offered me his jar. "Your turn," he said. "Take it with you." I hesitated, but something in his expression, kind, knowing, made me reach out. As soon as I touched the jar, the train stopped again, this time in a place I recognized, the diner. But it wasn't the same. The neon sign glowed brighter, the air hummed with energy, and when I stepped outside, the streets felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. Like everything was sharper, more vivid, more real. I never saw the train again. The jar sits on my nightstand now, the fireflies inside still glowing softly. I don't know what they are or what they mean, but every time I look at them, I feel that same hum in the air, the same promise of something just around the corner. Have you ever stumbled into a moment that felt like it belonged to another world? Like something extraordinary had chosen you? I woke up at 7:13 a.m. sharp, not because of my alarm clock, but because my comforter sighed. Like a deep, dramatic, "You've got to be kidding me" sigh. At first, I thought maybe I had just shifted weirdly and made the fabric puff. But no, the sigh was followed by a low, judgmental murmur. Must be nice to just lie around all night doing absolutely nothing. It was my comforter, my blanket, and it sounded exhausted. I lay there for a moment, debating whether I was awake or in some post-Netflix fever dream. That's when my pillow chimed in the most passive-aggressive tone you can imagine. "Oh, sure. Don't thank me for supporting your head all night. I only saved you from another kinked neck. No big deal." I bolted upright, heart racing. The bed frame groaned beneath me, muttering, "Oh, great. She's up. Time to carry her weight around again." My first thought was paranormal activity. My second thought was, ghosts don't complain about lumbar support. So, naturally, I did the only logical thing. I asked, hello? At this point, every object in my room came alive like I'd accidentally wandered into some off-brand Disney musical. My nightstand tooted disapprovingly at the clutter of half-empty water glasses. The curtains, with the dramatic flair of someone who's seen too many soap operas, gasped. Finally, someone acknowledges me. I've been holding back the sun all morning, but do I get a thank you? Of course not. Even the rug joined in. "Watch where you're stepping today. You're always dragging mud on me." I don't know if you've ever had a morning where your furniture starts airing grievances, but let me tell you, it's a lot to process before coffee. Speaking of which, I staggered into the kitchen, hoping maybe the objects there would be less chatty. Spoiler, they were not. The coffee maker was practically vibrating with rage. "Oh, look who finally showed up. I've been ready to brew since 6 a.m. The mugs were equally irritable. "Pick one of us already," snapped my favorite blue one. "You always grab me, and I'm sick of it. Let someone else do the heavy lifting for once." Meanwhile, the fridge sighed. "You know there's yogurt in here that's older than some civilizations, right? Just throwing that out there." As I poured coffee into the blue mug, because honestly, at this point, I wasn't about to negotiate with ceramics. Juniper, my cat, strolled into the room. For half a second, I felt a spark of hope. At least my cat isn't talking, I thought. Oh, how wrong I was. "Morning," she said, hopping onto the counter. Her voice was sleek and smug, like someone who already knows the answer to every question you're about to ask. "You look awful. Rough night?" I stared at her, jaw slack. She flicked her tail lazily and added, "Don't bother trying to figure it out. We've been waiting for this day forever. You're late, honestly. Most humans unlock this skill by 30. Wait, I managed to croak. You've been able to talk this whole time?" "Obviously," she replied, licking a paw. "But you weren't ready. You still might not be. We'll see." Before I could respond, my toaster popped up with no bread in it and shouted, "Toast time, baby." I jumped about 3 feet in the air, nearly spilling my coffee. Juniper rolled her eyes. "Ignore him. He's always like that. Lives for chaos." By mid-morning, I'd resigned myself to the fact that my entire home had decided to join a union and make me its unwilling delegate. The vacuum cleaner suggested I use it once in a while, and the bathtub lamented how I always took showers instead of enjoying a proper soak. Even my toothbrush, of all things, lectured me on technique. "You're not brushing long enough. 2 minutes minimum. I've been telling you this for years, but do you listen?" No. In a desperate bid for sanity, I went outside, hoping the fresh air would quiet the madness. Instead, I was greeted by a chorus of voices. The mailbox called out, "Hey, don't forget to empty me." "I'm practically bursting." The lawnmower grumbled. "When's the last time you gave me a break? I'm not a machine, you know." "Oh, wait, I am." And the neighborhood squirrels. "Oh, the squirrels." "Hey, lady," one of them shouted, hanging upside down from a tree branch. "You're out of birdseed. You think we don't notice? We've been watching. Do better." Another one chimed in. "Also, that sunflower you planted last spring? Total disappointment. Barely any seeds." Feeling utterly defeated, I flopped onto a lawn chair, only for it to creak. "Careful, you're heavier than you look." My neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, was watering her roses and gave me a strange look as I muttered, "Shut up," to an inanimate object. I briefly considered explaining myself, but how do you casually tell someone, "Oh, don't mind me, I'm just arguing with my lawn chair"? As the day went on, I started to notice that not every object was a complainer. The houseplants, for example, were downright pleasant. "We're so proud of you for keeping us alive," said the fern on the windowsill. The pothose hanging from the ceiling added, "Remember, we like indirect sunlight and just a little water, okay?" Honestly, their supportive energy was a welcome change. By evening, I was starting to get the hang of it. Sure, it was weird that the light bulbs hummed little songs when I turned them on, and it was unsettling that my slippers had opinions about my sock choices, but there was something oddly comforting about it all. My home didn't just feel alive, it felt full, like every object, every little thing, had been quietly watching, waiting for its moment to connect with me. As I climbed into bed, my comforter wrapped around me with an audible huff, but there was no malice in it this time. My pillow sighed, "Good night. Try not to drool, okay?" Juniper curled up next to me, purring softly. "You did okay today," she murmured. "Not great, but okay." I decided to take that as a win. So, if you were in my shoes, waking up to a world where everything, from your cat to your coffee maker to the literal ground you walk on, has a voice, how do you think you'd handle it? Would it drive you insane? Or do you think you'd find a weird kind of comfort in the chaos? Every Thursday night, without fail, we built a city out of blankets. Not just a fort, a city. It started as a silly idea one rainy evening when the power went out. We lit every candle we could find, dragged the couch cushions onto the floor, and began stacking chairs and books to create these wobbly walls that towered over us. I called it Fort Awesome. She rolled her eyes, naturally, and renamed it the Great Pillowopolis. That's how it started, a goofy one-off to pass the time. But somehow, it became our thing. Every Thursday, we cleared the living room, pulled out our ever-growing collection of blankets, and let our imaginations run wild. She took it more seriously than I did, if I'm honest. I would just start draping blankets wherever they fit, but she had blueprints. Actual blueprints, sketched on a napkin or the back of a grocery receipt, complete with towers, tunnels, and, once, a balcony. One Thursday, she declared she was the city planner and gave me permits for where I could and couldn't build. Another week, we spent hours creating a skyline, out of string lights and cardboard boxes so we could sit inside the fort and pretend we were gazing out at a glowing metropolis. Somewhere along the way, we started naming each fort like they were neighborhoods: Blanketopia, Snugsville, the United Throws of America. Every city was different, but there was one rule that stayed the same. We couldn't just build it. We had to live in it, even if just for a few hours. Inside the fort, the rest of the world didn't exist. We'd crawl in with snacks, always popcorn for her, chips and salsa for me, and tell each other ridiculous stories about the citizens of our new city. One time, we invented a family of raccoons who owned a bakery and gossiped about their squirrel neighbors. Another time, we pretended we were secret spies hiding out after a daring museum heist. The walls of the fort turned every mundane moment into an adventure. We'd play cards by flashlight, laugh until our stomachs hurt, or just sit quietly, listening to the rain on the windows or the hum of the fridge. Inside that fragile fabric world, nothing else mattered. Not work deadlines, not student loans, not the argument we'd had about whose turn it was to do the dishes. Just us, the fort, and the stories we wove inside it. One Thursday, I got home late from work. One of those brutal days where every meeting feels like a marathon and every email a minefield. My phone was dead, my head was pounding, and all I wanted to do was collapse into bed. But when I walked into the living room, there it was, the start of a new city. She'd already strung up the lights and hung a banner made of old scarves that read, "Welcome to Snuggle Heights." She was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the half-built fort, grinning at me like she'd just won the lottery. "I know you're tired," she said, "but the mayor of Snuggle Heights really needs your help constructing the East Wing." I couldn't help but laugh. I didn't even take off my shoes before I grabbed a blanket and started draping it over the chairs. My exhaustion melted away as we worked together, her bossing me around like a foreman on a construction site, me pretending to argue but following her every instruction. By the time the fort was finished, it was the biggest one we'd ever built. We made a tunnel that led to the couch, a turret that reached all the way to the ceiling fan, and a tiny nook just big enough for the two of us to sit side by side. She handed me a flashlight and a bowl of popcorn, and for the next few hours, we forgot the rest of the world existed. Not every fort was perfect. There were days when the chairs wouldn't stay upright or the blankets kept slipping, and one particularly chaotic night when we accidentally knocked over a candle and almost set the whole thing on fire. But even the disasters became part of the ritual. Once, after a fort collapsed while we were inside it, she declared, "This is clearly an earthquake zone. We need to rebuild with better infrastructure." Another time, we tried using bungee cords to make the ceiling higher, only to have the entire structure snap like a rubber band and send us both tumbling to the floor. We laughed so hard we couldn't breathe. Eventually, life got busier, as it does. The Thursday night tradition became less of a constant and more of a fond memory we'd occasionally revisit, like flipping through an old photo album. One Thursday, she was working late. Another, I was out of town. The blankets stayed folded in the closet, the string lights tucked away in a box. We told ourselves we'd get back to it eventually, but weeks turned into months, and the forts became a thing of the past. Now, I live in a different apartment, smaller and quieter, with no room for sprawling cities of pillows and chairs. The blankets are still with me, though. Every so often, I'll pull one out and remember the way she used to fuss over the fort blueprints, or how we once spent an entire night debating whether popcorn counts as a vegetable because it's technically corn. I haven't built a fort in years, but sometimes I catch myself glancing at the chairs in my kitchen, wondering if they'd be sturdy enough to hold up a tower of blankets. It's funny, isn't it? How these little traditions, the ones that seem so trivial at the time, end up meaning the most. They become anchors, holding you steady in the chaos of life, even after the person who shared them with you is gone. I don't think I'll ever look at a pile of blankets without thinking of those Thursday nights and the cities we built together. So, what about you? Do you have any small, silly rituals that make your relationships feel special? I was sitting in a park, the kind that tries to convince you it's still nature despite the coffee cart humming softly in the background and a suspiciously symmetrical row of flowers bordering the path. It was one of those days where the weather couldn't make up its mind. One minute the sun was beaming like a proud parent, the next, clouds rolled in like they were late for a meeting. I didn't mind. I was here to people watch, which has become my favorite unpaid hobby. And let me tell you, the world does not disappoint. It started with a guy wearing roller skates and a cowboy hat, gliding past like it was the most natural combination in the world. I don't know where he was going, but he seemed to, and honestly, that felt like a metaphor for modern life. A few minutes later, a woman walked by, cradling a gray cat in a baby sling, chatting with it like it was an old friend. She stopped to buy an iced coffee from the cart and asked the barista, completely seriously, if the whipped cream on her drink was safe for cats. The barista didn't miss a beat. "We don't recommend it, ma'am, but this city doesn't follow rules, so do what feels right." And honestly, that answer hit me harder than it should have. Maybe we're all just winging it, hoping the whipped cream of life won't hurt us. The woman nodded, took the coffee, no whipped cream, and walked off, the cat peering over her shoulder like a judgmental pirate. Not 5 minutes later, 2 kids came zooming down the path on scooters, screaming something about battle mode. They were dressed in full-on cardboard armor, duct tape shields, and pool noodle swords. As they whizzed by, an older man sitting nearby, probably their grandpa, just shouted, "Remember, no fatalities," in the kind of deadpan voice that suggested he'd seen some things during these so-called battles. The kids hollered back, "Yes, Captain," and disappeared around the corner, leaving a trail of laughter and the faint smell of sunscreen. It was about then I noticed something odd. A man sitting on the next bench was furiously knitting. Not a scarf or a hat, mind you, but what appeared to be an entire sweater. His fingers were flying, the needles clacking in a way that sounded both soothing and slightly menacing, like a tiny storm brewing in his lap. I tried not to stare, but the guy noticed me watching and said, without looking up, "Deadlines don't wait just because the sun's out." What kind of deadline requires public knitting? I didn't ask. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. By now, the park was starting to feel like a cross between a sitcom and a dream sequence. A young couple in matching tracksuits sat down near me and immediately started filming a TikTok dance. The woman nailed every move with precision, while the guy looked like he was actively fighting gravity. They didn't seem to mind the difference in skill levels, though, and when they finished, she gave him a high five and said, "You're improving. Less noodle arms this time." He grinned like she just handed him an Oscar. I thought that would be the peak of my people-watching adventure, but I was wrong. Because then, a man in a full three-piece suit strolled into the park holding, wait for it, a giant bubble wand. Not one of those tiny wands you get with a $1 bottle of soap, but the kind that makes bubbles big enough to fit a toddler inside. He didn't say a word, just dipped the wand into his bucket and started creating these enormous, glistening bubbles that floated lazily through the air. At first, people ignored him, but then a little girl ran up, laughing and trying to catch the bubbles. Her mom joined in, followed by a guy walking his dog, and within minutes, the whole park felt like it had been taken over by this spontaneous, glittering chaos. I watched as one particularly massive bubble drifted toward the knitting man, who paused his work just long enough to pop it with the tip of his needle. He gave a tiny, satisfied nod before returning to his furious sweater production. The bubble man eventually wandered off, his bucket sloshing slightly, leaving behind a park full of people who looked lighter somehow, like they'd been reminded that the world is still capable of magic. I sat there for a while longer, sipping my coffee and wondering when we all collectively decided that it was okay to just be weird. And not weird in the way that makes people uncomfortable, but weird in the way that feels like an inside joke with the universe. It's like everyone got the memo that life is short, the planet is spinning too fast, and honestly, we might as well enjoy the ride. As the sun started setting, the park shifted gears. The TikTok dancers packed up, the cardboard warriors returned for debriefing, and the cat-in-a-sling lady reappeared, now wearing a tiny hat that matched her cat's. The guy with the bubble wand was nowhere to be seen, but a small boy found one of his bubbles still clinging to a flower, unpopped. He crouched down to inspect it like he'd discovered buried treasure, then ran off shouting, "It's still alive." I mean, come on. How do you not love humanity in moments like that? On my way home, I kept thinking about the park and all its characters. It felt like a little microcosm of what it means to be alive right now. Chaotic, funny, sometimes downright bizarre, but somehow comforting in its randomness. And it made me wonder, what's the strangest or most delightful thing you've noticed about the world lately? Something that feels like it could only happen right here, right now? I'd love to hear about it. The other day, I got caught in one of those random existential spirals while trying to untangle my earbuds. It wasn't just the frustration of the cords themselves. They've been plotting against me since 2004. It was the sudden realization that I even still have wired earbuds. Somewhere along the way, we collectively decided wires were passé, like those infomercial gadgets people couldn't operate without falling over. And yet, here I am, holding my tiny knot of chaos like a fossil from an era when people actually argued about how to store music files. Remember that? MP3 players, CDs, LimeWire? I'm convinced half of us became tech-savvy just to figure out how to burn a playlist onto a disk without accidentally giving our family computer a virus. But here's where it got weird. Untangling those earbuds felt nostalgic, like holding a little time capsule of simpler frustrations. It reminded me of all the other tiny dramas that have quietly vanished from our lives. Rolling down a car window with a crank, shouting at your sibling because they picked up the house phone and killed your internet connection. The art of rewinding a VHS tape just enough to rewatch your favorite scene. There's something oddly beautiful about how those little rituals, quirks of their time, were once so normal. And now, they're stories we tell younger people who look at us like we're describing medieval battle tactics. I took this train of thought with me as I walked to my favorite little corner cafe. Not because I needed coffee, okay, I definitely needed coffee, but because I wanted to sit somewhere that wasn't my apartment just to feel like I'd gone out. That's another thing I've noticed about life these days. We've turned going to coffee shops into an event, like it's our modern-day version of gathering around a village well. Nobody's fetching water, but we're all here, sipping overpriced caffeine and pretending to work on our laptops. And yet, there's something charming about it. The shared silence, the soft hum of espresso machines, the way everyone glances up just long enough to notice a dog tied up outside before returning to their screens. It's like we're all collectively agreeing to exist together in the same space, but with minimal interaction. A quiet, unsaid camaraderie. While I waited for my drink, I got sucked into watching the barista work. It's practically a performance art now, isn't it? The way they froth the milk with laser focus and sprinkle cinnamon with the precision of a seasoned chef plating a Michelin-starred dessert. And don't even get me started on latte art. I got a heart-shaped foam design once and almost didn't drink it because I felt like I was ruining someone's masterpiece. Spoiler alert, I drank it. Love can't stand in the way of caffeine. I took my cup and wandered over to a park bench to sit for a bit, and that's when I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. How much communication has changed, even in casual public spaces. A woman was jogging past, earbuds in, having what sounded like a very intense conversation, but not into her phone, just to the air around her. At first, I thought she was a little unhinged, but then I saw her Bluetooth earpiece and realized she was just a modern multitasker. It struck me as funny how these little devices have completely erased the social stigma of talking to yourself in public. If someone from the 90s time traveled here, they'd think half the population had lost their minds. And then there's texting, which is its own kind of linguistic gymnastics. I once spent 10 minutes deciding how many Y's to put in "hey" to make sure it sounded friendly, but not too friendly. We've invented an entirely new layer of nuance to language just by overthinking punctuation and emojis. A single K can feel colder than a January morning, while a perfectly placed crying laughing face can defuse any awkward situation. Honestly, if future anthropologists ever try to decode our communication habits, they're going to need a team of linguists, psychologists, and probably a couple of teenagers just to make sense of it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through Instagram for a bit, which has somehow become the modern equivalent of people watching. There's something deeply entertaining about the carefully curated chaos of social media. A friend posts a picture of their morning avocado toast, complete with a philosophical caption like, "Time is fleeting, so savor the little things," as if Socrates himself had weighed in on breakfast. And then, in the very next post, someone's dog is wearing sunglasses, and I'm all in for it. Say what you want about social media, but the juxtaposition is unbeatable. It's like flipping channels on the weirdest TV network ever created, and somehow, we're all both the audience and the cast. As I sat there scrolling, the sun started to dip lower in the sky, painting everything in that perfect golden hour light that makes even the most mundane scenes look cinematic. It reminded me how much we've started to notice beauty in everyday things. Maybe because we're always trying to capture it. Sure, people joke about influencers posing dramatically in front of parking garages, but isn't it kind of wonderful that we're looking at the world through a lens of possibility? That cracked sidewalk isn't just a sidewalk anymore. It's a backdrop for someone's impromptu photo shoot. On the way home, I passed a group of kids playing soccer in a cul-de-sac. One of them had to pause the game to answer his smartwatch, which made me laugh out loud. I mean, this kid is living in the future. When I was his age, the most high-tech gadget I owned was a Tamagotchi that died every other day because I forgot to feed it. But watching him seamlessly switch between modern tech and good old-fashioned kick-the-ball-around fun gave me hope. Sure, the world is changing fast, but some things, like the joy of running around with your friends until you're out of breath, are timeless. By the time I got home, the earbuds in my pocket had tangled themselves again, like they were trying to remind me of where this whole thought spiral began. I sat down, picked at the knots for a while, and smiled to myself. It's funny how life keeps evolving, but these little quirks, tangled cords, latte art, awkward texts, still find a way to connect us. What's something small and ordinary in your life that feels like a tiny piece of magic? Rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Inside the diner, the fluorescent lights hummed quietly, casting an artificial glow on the cracked vinyl booths and greasy countertops. A waitress in a faded uniform leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, while an older man in a trucker cap nursed a cup of black coffee near the window. The smell of fried onions hung in the air, thick and cloying, like a memory that refused to leave. This was the kind of place people passed through, not one they stayed in. But tonight, everyone inside felt trapped, bound by the relentless storm outside. Except for the man in the corner booth. He looked out of place in a way that wasn't immediately obvious. It wasn't just the clean, tailored suit or the gold watch glinting faintly under the dim lights. It was something deeper, something unsettling, like he was too sharp, too precise to belong here. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly on the table, staring down at the menu as if it held secrets no one else could see. I noticed him as soon as I walked in. It was impossible not to. The way the air seemed to shift around him, heavy and electric, like a storm waiting to break. I slid into the booth across from him without thinking, my soaked jacket dripping onto the red vinyl seat. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and calm, without looking up. "Excuse me?" I said, pulling off my hood and wringing out my hair. The rain had left me chilled to the bone, and I was in no mood for cryptic remarks from strangers. He finally looked up, and I regretted sitting down. His eyes were a pale, icy blue, the kind of eyes that seemed to see too much. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "This isn't your kind of place." I wanted to snap back with something clever, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I shrugged, trying to play it off. "It's just a diner, and I'm just here for coffee." He didn't smile, didn't move, just sat there, watching me like he was waiting for something. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "All right, coffee it is." The waitress appeared at the edge of the table, her notepad held loosely in one hand. "What can I get you?" "Coffee," I said, glancing at the man across from me. "And whatever he's having." Her brow furrowed slightly, as if she wanted to ask why I was sitting with a man I clearly didn't know. But she just nodded and walked away, her shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. The man leaned back in his seat, his gaze still fixed on me. "You really shouldn't have sat down." "Look," I said, crossing my arms. "If you want the booth to yourself, just say so. Don't play the mysterious stranger card." He tilted his head slightly, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Mysterious stranger, huh? Is that what I am?" "I don't know," I shot back, "but you're definitely not normal." He laughed, a low, quiet sound that didn't match the sharpness in his eyes. "You're not wrong." Before I could respond, the waitress returned with 2 cups of coffee. She set them down carefully, her movements almost reverent, as if she were handling something fragile. The man didn't thank her, didn't even look at her, and she walked away without saying a word. I took a sip of my coffee, mostly to buy myself time. It was bitter and scalding, but it grounded me. "So," I said, setting the cup down, "what's your deal? You some kind of traveling salesman? A hitman? An escaped convict? Would you believe me if I said none of the above?" "Nope." He smiled, and for the first time, it felt genuine. "Fair enough." We sat in silence for a moment, the rain pounding against the windows like it was trying to get in. I could feel the unease building in my chest, the sense that I had stumbled into something I didn't fully understand. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave. "You're curious," he said, breaking the silence. "Maybe." He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "Do you believe in fate?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know. I guess it depends on the day. Good answer, he said. Because tonight, fate brought you here. I frowned, glancing around the diner. I think it was the rain, actually. He chuckled, a sound that felt warmer this time. More human? Maybe. Or maybe the rain was just the excuse. Excuse for what? For us to meet, he said simply. The way he said it, like it was the most natural thing in the world, sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to say, so I just stared at him, waiting for him to explain. But he didn't. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver coin. He placed it on the table between us, spinning it slowly with his fingertips. This, he said, his voice low and measured, is your choice. I stared at the coin, my reflection shimmering faintly on its surface. What are you talking about? One side, he said, tapping the coin gently, changes everything. The other side leaves things exactly as they are. That's ridiculous, I said, but my voice wavered. Maybe it is, he said, leaning back in his seat, but it's your call. I looked at him, then at the coin. My heart was pounding, a steady drumbeat that filled the space between us. I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was crazy, but something about the way he sat there, calm and unshaken, made me hesitate. What happens if I don't choose? I asked. He shrugged. Then nothing changes. You walk out of here, and your life goes on exactly the way it's been. And if I do? His eyes softened, just for a moment. Then you find out what happens next. The coin sat there, gleaming under the flickering diner lights, a small, simple thing that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and picked it up. Flip it, he said quietly. I held the coin between my thumb and forefinger, my pulse racing. This was ridiculous. It was just a coin, just a game. But as I flicked it into the air and watched it spin, I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. The coin landed on the table with a soft clink, rolling briefly before coming to a stop. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. The man smiled, his pale blue eyes gleaming. And so it begins. I was walking to work, the morning sun just starting to graze the tops of the buildings, when I noticed a man crouched on the sidewalk. He was tying his sneaker, his face calm, almost meditative, as the world rushed by around him. There was something oddly dignified about it. No hurry, no shame in pausing mid-commute to secure a loose end. People streamed around him like water splitting around a stone, earbuds in, eyes forward, missing this small act of focus and care. For reasons I can't quite explain, I slowed down and watched him for a few steps, then kept moving. But the shoelace stayed with me. As I walked, I started to notice other tiny rituals unfolding in the chaos of the city. At the corner bodega, the cashier was meticulously arranging a stack of bananas, rotating each one until the curve faced just so. Outside a coffee shop, a woman stood with her back to the wall, carefully unscrewing the lid of her travel mug to let the steam escape. Her lips pursed as if savoring the moment before the first sip. Across the street, a man leaned out of a cab window, waving wildly at someone who didn't wave back. His hand dropped slowly, but he smiled anyway, like he'd decided the effort was still worth it. It felt like the city was alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Not just a place, but a living, breathing organism, pulsing with the unremarkable but deeply human details of everyday life. And me? I felt like some kind of alien anthropologist, dropped here to observe it all. It wasn't my first morning walk to work, not by a long shot, but for some reason, it felt like the first time I'd actually seen any of it. Near the bus stop, I passed a row of people standing in a line that curved almost perfectly parallel to the curb. No one had planned it, it just happened. The woman at the front of the line was staring at her phone with a look of mild frustration, her free hand fiddling with the hem of her coat. A teenage boy a few spots down was slouched over, his backpack hanging off one shoulder as if even gravity couldn't make him care. And right behind him, an older man with a gray beard and a fedora stood upright, hands clasped neatly in front of him like a soldier on leave. Each of them a character in a play no one was directing, yet their postures, their expressions, the way they shifted their weight every so often, it all had a rhythm, like they were dancers in some unnoticed ballet. And then there was the bus itself. When it arrived, everyone snapped to attention. Some stood back to let others board first, while one or two cut the line entirely, slipping on with the kind of boldness only a crowded city can breed. I followed the shuffle of feet up the steps, taking a seat by the window. Outside, the city buzzed on, but inside the bus, it was its own world. A woman up front was arguing with her kid in a whisper that still somehow carried all the weight of a shout. "I told you no," she hissed, the kind of tone that made me sit up straighter in solidarity with her invisible authority. A man in the aisle was holding a bouquet of flowers awkwardly against his chest, the petals brushing against his chin every time the bus jolted. He kept glancing at the flowers like he wasn't sure they'd survive the ride. I wondered who they were for, and if the recipient would notice the effort behind them. The risk of carrying something so fragile on public transit during rush hour. At the next stop, a guy in a paint-splattered hoodie got on, holding a tiny to-go box with an iced coffee balanced precariously on top. He moved with the kind of precision that only comes from years of carrying things in one hand, and I found myself rooting for him as he navigated the aisle. When he sat down, the coffee wobbled but didn't spill. He caught my eye, gave me a quick nod, and then opened the box to reveal a perfectly folded slice of pizza. For breakfast. I didn't mean to stare, but he caught me again and shrugged, his face breaking into a lopsided grin. "Best time to eat it," he said, as if I'd asked. And somehow, I believed him. By the time I got off the bus, the morning felt like it had stretched into hours. I walked through the park, where a group of older men were setting up a game of chess on a weathered stone table. Their moves were slow, deliberate, as if the game had started decades ago, and they were just continuing it one piece at a time. Nearby, a woman sat on a bench, her dog tethered loosely to the armrest. She was knitting something bright yellow, her hands moving faster than seemed possible. The dog watched her with absolute devotion, the kind of quiet love that felt almost too private to witness. I kept walking, my mind buzzing with all these tiny moments. It struck me how much of our lives play out like this, quiet, unnoticed, and yet completely essential. A shoelace gets tied, a banana gets rotated, a bouquet of flowers makes its way across the city. None of it seems important on its own, but together, it creates this intricate, invisible web of humanity. Like the city is a great big machine, and all of us are its gears, turning and shifting in sync without even realizing it. When I finally made it to work, I passed the receptionist, who was laughing at something on her phone. I didn't ask what it was, but her laughter lingered with me for hours. It felt like the kind of thing that could ripple outward, affecting people she didn't even know. Maybe the world works like that, a series of invisible exchanges, each one nudging the next along. I can't stop thinking about it now. These tiny, nearly invisible moments, how they shape everything around us in ways we'll never fully understand. What about you? What's the last thing you noticed that made you feel like a traveler in your own world? I was running late. Not fashionably late. Just the kind of late where you're cursing at red lights and mentally drafting excuses while swearing you'll never try a new eyeliner right before a date again. By the time I arrived, I was frazzled, apologetic, and carrying the distinct energy of someone who almost spilled coffee on herself twice that day. He, of course, looked completely unbothered, standing outside the little cafe with his hands tucked into his pockets like he had all the time in the world. "You made it," he said, grinning, not a hint of annoyance in his voice. That grin was unfair. It was the kind that made you want to forgive him for things he hadn't even done yet. I apologized profusely anyway, but he waved it off. "Perfect timing," he said, tilting his head toward the door. "Our table's ready." Now, I didn't know what to expect from this guy. We'd met in a shared interest group online and hit it off over a conversation about bad 90s sci-fi movies, of all things. This was our second date, and he already had this way of making me feel like I'd known him for years. Still, I wasn't prepared for what came next. As we walked inside, he stopped short, glancing back at me with a mischievous look. "Before we sit, there's something I want to show you," he said, nodding toward a staircase in the corner of the cafe. I followed him, admittedly intrigued, but also vaguely wondering if this was how horror movie plots began. The cafe upstairs was dimly lit, more of a cozy storage space than anything, but there, tucked between shelves of old books and dusty wine bottles, was an antique phonograph. "Here," he said, pulling out a record that had been resting next to it. "I know it's weird, but this is the real reason I wanted to come here." He set the record on the turntable, cranked the handle, and let it play. The music that drifted out was scratchy and old, something jazzy and dreamy, and the whole space suddenly felt transported to another time. He turned to me, his grin softening into something almost shy. "My grandfather used to have one of these. Every Friday night, he'd pull it out, put on some record that looked like it could break in half with a sneeze, and just slow dance with my grandmother in the living room. It didn't matter what else was going on. He'd always make time for that. I figured, if you're okay with it, maybe we could try it." I stared at him, caught off guard in the best possible way. There wasn't an ounce of pretension or expectation in his voice, just a sweet kind of earnestness that made it impossible to say no. So, I nodded, and before I could overthink it, he gently took my hand and led me to an open patch of floor. The thing is, neither of us could really dance. He stepped on my toes at least twice, and I accidentally elbowed him when I got too enthusiastic with a spin. We were both laughing so hard by the end of the song that we nearly knocked over a shelf. But there was this moment, just one fleeting, heart-stopping moment, when I caught his eye and everything else faded. The music, the awkwardness, the upstairs clutter, it all melted away, and all I could think was, this is what it's supposed to feel like. When the song ended, we went downstairs like nothing had happened, just two people on an ordinary date. Dinner was great. Lots of banter about which actor gave the worst performance in that awful sci-fi movie we both secretly loved. But that moment upstairs kept replaying in my mind. The way he looked at me, like he wasn't thinking about anything else in the world, was the kind of thing I thought only happened in books or movies. After dinner, we walked outside, and he hesitated. "Wait," he said, and there was that mischievous look again. He pulled a small slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to me. It was folded neatly, and when I opened it, I saw it was a receipt. Confused, I glanced back at him, and he smiled, pointing to the bottom corner where he'd scribbled a note. "Tonight's dance lesson is on the house. Next time, bring better shoes." I laughed, folding the paper and tucking it into my bag. We said our goodbyes, but as I walked away, I couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't about the phonograph, or the song, or even the dance itself. It was about the effort, the thoughtfulness, the way he'd taken something personal to him, something vulnerable, and shared it with me like it was the most natural thing in the world. The memory of that night lingers like the last notes of an old record, scratchy but perfect in its imperfection. It wasn't some grand, sweeping romance, but it was enough to leave an imprint, a reminder of how special it feels when someone takes the time to make you feel like the only person in the room. Have you ever had a moment on a date that stayed with you forever? I woke up to find that the ceiling was gone, not missing in a catastrophic way. No gaping hole or exposed beams, just gone. In its place was a slow swirl of galaxies, each star flickering like it was winking directly at me. One particularly cheeky nebula spun faster when it caught me staring. "Good morning," it seemed to hum, though I'm not sure if it was sound or thought. Either way, I figured it was rude not to respond. So I said, "Good morning," and swung my legs out of bed like this was all perfectly normal. Because, well, it was. In the kitchen, my stove was baking cookies without permission again. "You always make oatmeal raisin," I sighed, opening the oven door. "Nobody actually likes oatmeal raisin." "I do," the stove replied haughtily. I could see its knobs flush with indignation. "Besides, they're not for you. They're for the crows." That explained the 5 or 6 crows perched on my windowsill, staring at me with their 2 intelligent eyes. One of them gave a low caw, which I was pretty sure translated to, "About time." I shooed them away gently and tossed the cookies onto the lawn. The crows snatched them midair with a level of coordination that would put most dance troupes to shame. I stood there, coffee in hand, wondering for the 100th time if I'd somehow made a blood pact with them in a past life. Outside, the air shimmered with possibilities. You could feel it in your lungs when you breathed. Like the world was less solid than it pretended to be, and at any moment it might rearrange itself just for the fun of it. The sun was playing peekaboo behind clouds shaped like improbably accurate portraits of historical figures. I spotted Napoleon glaring down at me from his fluffy perch, and I gave him a sarcastic salute. The cloud shifted, almost like it was sulking. I headed down the street, which had reconfigured itself overnight into a spiral. This was mildly inconvenient, but undeniably beautiful. The cobblestones glowed faintly, like they had secrets they were dying to tell. I passed a lamppost that had grown arms and was knitting a scarf. "Morning," it said without looking up. "Morning," I replied, not wanting to disturb its rhythm. Halfway down the spiral, I encountered a woman playing chess with the concept of regret. Regret was winning. Its pieces were little shadows, sharp-edged and sly, while hers were fragile, made of glass. She sighed as her queen shattered. "Tough game?" I asked. "It always is," she replied without looking up. "But I've beaten it before. You just have to trick it into thinking it's already won." That sounded like wisdom I wasn't ready to unpack, so I wished her luck and kept walking. At the center of the spiral was a cafe that only served questions. The menu was written in looping cursive across the walls, with options like "What do you dream about when you're not asleep?" And if you could unmeet one person, who would it be? The barista was a sentient breeze, and when I asked for something light but meaningful, it brought me a cup of "Why do you think the stars haven't left us yet?" I sipped it slowly, feeling the question unfold inside me like a paper flower dipped in water. My first thought was, because we're still worth watching. My second thought was, what if they've stayed because they're lonely too? I didn't finish the drink. Some questions are better left unanswered. On my way back, I saw a fox wearing a waistcoat and reading a map. It looked frustrated. "Lost?" I asked. "Not lost," it replied, folding the map with a flick of its tail. "Just exploring the scenic route. Where are you trying to go?" "Yesterday," it said, then trotted off before I could ask what that meant. By the time I got home, my house had decided to grow a second floor. The staircase spiraled upward like a piece of music, and I climbed it, curious. At the top was a room that wasn't there before, filled with things I didn't recognize but felt like I should. A pair of boots scuffed from adventures I didn't remember taking. A painting of a forest with trees that seemed to sway when I wasn't looking. On the desk was a letter addressed to me in handwriting that wasn't mine. "You'll understand eventually," it said. Nothing else. Outside the window, the galaxies from my ceiling had migrated to the sky, blending with the sunset in a way that made it impossible to tell where day ended and night began. I stood there, holding the letter, feeling like I was teetering on the edge of something vast and unknowable, but also oddly comforting. Like the universe had secrets, and for once, it was okay that they weren't mine to keep. So, if you woke up in a world where the rules of reality bent and stretched like warm taffy, what would you do first? It began with a door I'd never noticed before. That shouldn't have been possible. I'd walked past that alley on my way to work every day for 3 years, and I knew every crack in the pavement, every overflowing trash bin. But there it was, an old, weathered door, tucked into the brick wall like it had always been there. The wood was painted a faded green, with a tarnished brass handle and no sign or plaque to hint at what lay behind it. I probably would have kept walking if not for the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but as I got closer, it grew louder. Music. Not the kind you hear on the radio, but something richer, more alive, like a symphony played in a forest at dawn. It made the hair on my arms stand up, as if the notes themselves were whispering secrets to me. Something about the door pulled me in. Before I knew it, I'd reached out and turned the handle. The door swung open without resistance, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward, its stone steps worn smooth by countless feet. The air that wafted up was warm and fragrant, like spiced oranges and cedarwood. I hesitated, glancing back at the busy street behind me, but no one else seemed to notice the door or me standing in front of it. It was like I'd stepped out of the world entirely. I took a step inside, then another, and the door creaked shut behind me. The music grew louder, wrapping around me like a living thing, and I followed it down, down, down until the stairs gave way to a vast underground hall. It was nothing like I expected. Strings of glowing orbs floated in the air, casting soft light over a bustling marketplace. Stalls were draped with colorful fabrics and piled high with goods that didn't belong in any ordinary world. Silver fruit that sparkled like stars, jars of what looked like bottled rainbows, clocks with faces that ticked backward, and books whose words rearranged themselves as you read them. The people manning the stalls weren't ordinary either. Some had shimmering skin or eyes that glowed faintly. Others had feathers for hair or shadows that moved independently of their bodies. I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt alive. Like I'd stumbled into the place I was always meant to find but never knew existed. A man with fox-like features noticed me gawking and waved me over to his stall. "First time, eh?" he said, his voice low and melodic. Before I could answer, he slid a small vial across the counter toward me. "Take this," he said. "You'll need it before the night ends." "What is it?" I asked, staring at the swirling golden liquid inside. He grinned, sharp teeth glinting. "Payment. You'll see." I wanted to ask more, but he shooed me away with a flick of his wrist, so I slipped the vial into my pocket and wandered deeper into the market. Every turn revealed something more wondrous. A woman balancing on a tightrope strung between two impossibly tall poles, her dress billowing like a cloud. A boy with mismatched eyes who handed me a paper crane that unfolded itself into a map before flying off. A trio of musicians playing instruments I couldn't name, their music so vivid it painted scenes in the air around them. Rolling hills, crashing waves, an endless sky filled with stars. At the far end of the hall, I came to a fountain made of black stone, its water glittering like liquid moonlight. A sign above it read, "Make a wish, but be careful what you ask for." A girl no older than 10 stood by the fountain, tossing in a coin. She turned to me with a solemn expression, her voice soft but firm. "You should wish too," she said. "Everyone does." I didn't have a coin, but when I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushed against the vial the fox-faced man had given me. Without thinking, I uncorked it and let a single drop fall into the fountain. The water shimmered, then stilled, and for a moment, I felt a strange warmth spread through my chest, like a memory I couldn't quite grasp. "What did you wish for?" the girl asked. "I don't know," I admitted, and she smiled as if that was the right answer. The music shifted then, growing louder and more urgent, and the market began to change. The floating lights dimmed, and the stalls started closing one by one. People whispered hurried goodbyes, their faces tight with anticipation. "It's starting," someone murmured as they brushed past me. "What's starting?" I asked, but no one answered. Then, at the center of the hall, a grand clock tower I hadn't noticed before began to chime. The sound echoed like thunder, and with each chime, the world around me seemed to ripple. The crowd gathered in a loose circle, and I was swept along with them until we were all staring at a raised platform. A figure stood there, cloaked in midnight blue and holding a staff that glowed faintly at the tip. "Welcome, wanderers," the figure said, their voice echoing like it was coming from everywhere at once. "Tonight, the threshold opens. One of you may choose to cross." The crowd murmured, excitement and fear rippling through them. I wanted to ask what they meant, but before I could, the girl from the fountain stepped forward. "I'll go," she said, her voice steady despite her small frame. The cloaked figure nodded and raised their staff. A shimmering portal appeared behind them, its surface rippling like water. The girl turned back to look at me, her expression calm and knowing. "Thank you," she said, though I had no idea why. As she stepped through the portal, I felt a pang of longing so sharp it took my breath away. The cloaked figure turned to the rest of us. "The market is closing," they announced. "Take what you've learned and go." The crowd dispersed quickly, vanishing into shadowy corners and hidden doorways until I was alone again. I climbed the stairs back to the surface, my mind spinning with questions. When I pushed open the green door, the alley was quiet and empty, the bustling city unchanged. I've looked for that door every day since, but it's never appeared again. Sometimes, I pull out the paper crane the boy gave me or think about the vial of golden liquid I'll never see again, and I wonder if I imagined it all. But then, when I look at the stars or hear music that makes my heart ache, I feel the market's pulse, faint but steady, as if it's still out there, waiting. Have you ever found a door you weren't supposed to see? And if you walked through it, what was on the other side? The first time I saw the shadow, I thought it was just a trick of the light. It darted across the corner of my bedroom, quick and soundless, like a thought I wasn't supposed to have. It wasn't until the third time I saw it, standing still, impossibly tall in the reflection of my bathroom mirror, that I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was something else, something that was watching me. It started 2 weeks ago, the day after my grandfather's funeral. I had inherited his house, a sprawling Victorian relic that felt more like a museum than a home. It smelled of old books and varnish, and every room had that strange quality of being too big and too small at the same time. There was no Wi-Fi, which should have been my first red flag. No house without Wi-Fi is normal in 2024. I was unpacking boxes in the attic when I found it. An old trunk with brass fittings and a heavy padlock. The key was taped to the underside, as if whoever left it there had wanted it to be found, but also didn't want to make it too easy. Inside the trunk was a single item, a pocket watch. It was intricately designed, its surface engraved with swirling patterns that seemed to move if you stared at them for too long. There was no brand name, no markings other than a tiny inscription on the back that read, "To see is to bind." It wasn't like I thought the watch was cursed or anything. I'm not that kind of person, but there was something about it that unsettled me. Something in the way the hands ticked just slightly out of rhythm, like it was counting time differently than the rest of the world. That night, I dreamed of the shadow for the first time. It didn't move in the dream. It just stood at the foot of my bed, its outline blurry but unmistakably human. Its presence was heavy, like the weight of an incoming storm. When I woke up, the watch was on the nightstand, even though I was sure I had left it in the trunk. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences started to stack up. Lights flickered, even though the wiring in the house was supposedly updated. Doors that I had closed were open again when I turned around, and I kept hearing faint whispers that seemed to be coming from rooms I hadn't entered in weeks. I started sleeping with the lights on, though that didn't help much. The shadow had graduated from my dreams to reality. The thing about the shadow wasn't just that it existed, it was that it wasn't consistent. Sometimes it was small, lurking in corners like a stain on the wall. Other times, it filled entire rooms, a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the air. And yet, no matter how big or close it got, I couldn't bring myself to look directly at it. It was like my body knew something my mind refused to admit, that seeing it fully might change something I couldn't undo. I thought about leaving the house. I even packed a bag. But every time I reached the front door, I felt this overwhelming pull to stay. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like obligation, like I owed it to the house or the watch, or maybe the shadow itself. That's when I started to realize that whatever this was, it wasn't just about me. The house wanted something, and I was starting to think the shadow might too. One night, after hours of pacing and avoiding my own reflection, I finally decided to confront it. I took the pocket watch out of the trunk and held it tightly in my hand. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, like it was filled with more than just gears. I walked to the bathroom, where I'd seen the shadow last, and turned off the lights. It was there, waiting for me in the mirror. For the first time, I forced myself to look at it, really look at it. Its form was clearer now, though still undefined, like it was made of smoke that could hold its shape but not its solidity. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed faintly, a deep red that pulsed in time with the ticking of the watch. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The shadow tilted its head, mimicking me, and then it moved closer. Not in the mirror, in the room. I felt the temperature drop, and the air grew dense, like I was standing at the bottom of the ocean. The shadow reached out a hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, and pointed at the watch. "To see is to bind," it said, its voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What does that mean?" I asked, clutching the watch tighter. My heart was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to run. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it placed its hand over mine, over the watch, and I felt a sharp jolt of pain shoot up my arm. The world around me seemed to shift. the walls of the bathroom stretching and warping like a funhouse mirror. When I looked back at the shadow, it was no longer across from me. It was in me. Or maybe I was in it. The house was no longer my grandfather's house. The furniture was gone, replaced by strange, angular shapes that seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The air smelled of metal and something sweet, like burnt sugar. I realized with growing dread that I wasn't in the same reality anymore. The shadow was still there, but it was different now. It spoke again, but this time, its voice was clearer, more human. "You've seen me," it said. "Now you're bound to me." "Bound to what?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "To the truth," it replied, its form shifting into something almost recognizable, a distorted version of myself. "Time isn't what you think it is. This world isn't what you think it is." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening, but nothing made sense. "You'll understand soon," it said, and then it smiled. A smile that wasn't meant for a face like that. The next thing I knew, I was back in the attic, the pocket watch still in my hand. But the house felt different now, quieter, like it was holding its breath. And when I looked at the watch, I saw that the hands weren't ticking anymore. They were moving backward. I don't know what the shadow did to me, or why it chose me, but I haven't left the house since. Every time I think about going outside, I see the shadow's reflection in the windows, waiting for me, watching. And the watch? It's counting down to something. I don't know what happens when it reaches 0, but I'm starting to think I don't want to find out. The train's wheels screeched against the tracks, a metallic wail that seemed to echo all the way down the darkened platform. It was almost midnight, and the station was nearly empty, save for the occasional shuffle of a janitor's broom and the distant hum of a vending machine struggling to stay awake. I was supposed to be on a train heading west, toward my sister's wedding, toward a weekend of floral centerpieces and painfully polite conversations. But instead, I sat on a wooden bench with peeling paint, staring at a ticket for a train I wasn't sure I'd board. "Missed your ride?" a voice asked, pulling me out of my thoughts. I looked up to see a man standing a few feet away, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a weathered leather jacket. His face was sharp, all angles and shadows, but his eyes were disarmingly soft, like the kind you'd see on a stray dog just before it decided whether to trust you. "Not yet," I replied, folding the ticket in half. "Then you're either really early or really indecisive." He grinned, the kind of grin that dared you to let your guard down. I raised an eyebrow. "And which one are you?" "Neither. I'm just lost," he said, his tone light but his eyes flicking toward the station clock like he was running out of time. He sat down on the bench beside me without asking, close enough that I could smell the faint hint of smoke and rain clinging to him. Normally, I would have shifted away, but something about him made me stay put. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, like someone who'd been through a lot and still managed to find the joke in it. Or maybe it was just the fact that I was tired of being alone with my thoughts. "Where are you headed?" he asked, leaning back as if we were two old friends catching up. "Nowhere special," I said, which wasn't entirely true but felt easier than explaining the complicated knot of obligation and dread tied to my ticket. "Good answer," he said, nodding. "Most of the interesting places aren't on the schedule anyway." I laughed to spite myself. "And where are you going? Some unscheduled, interesting place?" His grin faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "You could say that." Before I could press him further, the overhead speakers crackled to life, announcing the arrival of a train heading east. He stood up abruptly, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and smoothing it out with the palm of his hand. "This is me," he said, his voice lighter now, almost casual. "You should come." I blinked at him, taken aback. "What?" "Come with me," he said, holding out his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stared at him, my brain scrambling for reasons to say no. I didn't know him. I didn't know where he was going. I didn't even know his name. But there was something in his expression, an openness, a quiet kind of desperation, that made me hesitate. "Why?" I asked finally. "Because you look like someone who could use a good story," he said, his lips quirking into that dare you grin again. "And this one's about to start." The train doors hissed open, and for a moment, the station seemed to hold its breath. I glanced down at my crumpled ticket, then back at him. "Fine," I said, shoving the ticket into my pocket and standing up. "But if this turns into a horror movie, I'm blaming you." "Deal," he said, his grin widening as he led the way toward the train. The moment we stepped on board, it felt like stepping into another world. The car was old, almost antique, with plush red seats and brass fixtures that gleamed under dim, flickering lights. A faint smell of lavender hung in the air, and the windows were fogged up as if the train were holding secrets it didn't want anyone to see. "This doesn't look like Amtrak," I muttered, glancing around. "It's not," he said, sliding into a seat by the window and gesturing for me to sit across from him. "But don't worry, it's better." I wanted to ask what the hell that meant, but before I could, the train lurched forward, and the world outside the window blurred into streaks of light and shadow. "So," I said, gripping the armrest as the train picked up speed, "are you going to tell me where we're actually going? Or is this part of the good story you promised?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and studying me like he was trying to decide how much to reveal. "We're going somewhere that doesn't exist on maps," he said finally. "A place where things get a little strange." "Strange how?" I asked, my curiosity outweighing my skepticism. He hesitated, then leaned back with a sigh. "You'll see." The train sped on, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels growing louder, almost hypnotic. Outside, the darkness seemed to deepen, swallowing the faint glow of distant towns until there was nothing but endless black. I should have been scared. I should have been questioning every decision that had led me to this moment. But instead, I felt a strange kind of calm, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, even if I didn't understand why. After what felt like hours, the train began to slow, the screech of the brakes cutting through the silence. When it finally stopped, the doors slid open to reveal a platform bathed in soft, golden light. Beyond it stretched a landscape unlike anything I'd ever seen. Rolling hills that shimmered like liquid gold, a sky painted with swirling shades of violet and indigo, and a river that glowed faintly, as if it were made of starlight. "Welcome," he said, standing and offering me his hand once more. "To what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "To the rest of your story." And against all logic, against all reason, I took his hand and stepped into the impossible. I woke up to find a single piece of parchment hovering in the air above my bed. It wasn't floating gently like a leaf caught on the wind. It was hovering with purpose, like it had somewhere to be and I was wasting its time. Scrawled across the front in looping gold script were the words, "Official notice. You have been selected." Selected for what? I muttered groggily, rubbing my eyes. The parchment flared brighter, like it was offended. "Don't talk to me like I'm your aunt's chain emails," it snapped, folding itself into a crisp origami crane and fluttering down to land on my chest. "Read me properly." Still half asleep, I unfolded it, and the text rearranged itself before my eyes. "Congratulations. You've been chosen to host this week's Realm Shuffle. All rules apply. All participants have been notified. Good luck." What does that even mean? I asked aloud. Before the paper could answer, the world shifted. Not in a subtle way, like when you realize your phone has auto-corrected your to your. No, this was the kind of shift you feel in your soul. My bedroom blurred like someone had smudged the edges of reality, and when it snapped back into focus, it wasn't my bedroom anymore. I was sitting in a cobblestone plaza surrounded by towering mushroom-shaped buildings. The sky overhead wasn't blue but a deep shade of lavender, dotted with what looked like tiny floating lanterns. A fountain bubbled in the center, except instead of water, it was pouring molten gold, which pooled around its base before disappearing into cracks in the ground. "Okay, this is new," I said, sitting up. "That's the point," said a voice behind me. I turned to see a creature that looked like a cross between a parrot and a dragon. It perched on a nearby lamppost, its scales iridescent and shimmering like spilled oil. "Welcome to the shuffle. Your world and 3 others are now overlapping. For a week, they're all mashed together like poorly made spaghetti. Should be fun. Fun? I repeated, standing up and trying to process the fact that this creature had spoken to me like we were old friends. What do you mean, overlapping? You'll figure it out, it squawked, clearly enjoying my confusion. Just remember, everything's got rules now, and consequences. Before I could demand clarification, the creature flapped its wings and took off, leaving me alone in the plaza. Or so I thought. The ground beneath me began to rumble, and a crack split open the cobblestones. From the crevice emerged a tiny army of what I could only describe as sentient gummy bears, each wielding a toothpick like a spear. Their leader, a particularly gelatinous green bear, stepped forward and barked, "Declare your allegiance." Allegiance to what? I asked, genuinely baffled. To the Candy Kingdom, obviously, he said, as if I were the one being unreasonable. Or are you one of the mushroom folk? Traitor. No allegiance here, I said quickly, raising my hands. Just passing through. The gummy bears grumbled among themselves, but before they could decide my fate, a booming voice echoed from the fountain. Silence, sweets. The human is under my protection. I turned to see the molten gold rising up from the fountain, forming itself into a humanoid figure with glowing eyes and liquid arms. It pointed at me. You've been marked as the host of this shuffle. You're neutral ground, right? I said, swallowing hard. Glad we cleared that up. The gummy bears retreated reluctantly, their leader muttering something about bureaucracy ruining the fun. The molten figure, apparently satisfied, melted back into the fountain without another word. Okay, I said to myself, trying to keep my nerves in check. New rules. New worlds. Don't die. Got it. I wandered through the streets, trying to piece together what exactly had happened. Every corner revealed something stranger than the last. A flock of flying fish swam through the lavender sky, trailing ribbons of light. A group of humanoid mushrooms sat at an outdoor cafe, sipping what looked like steaming cups of sunlight. At one point, I passed a vending machine that dispensed advice instead of snacks. You're overthinking everything, it told me when I pressed a button. Relax. But things got weirder when I turned down an alley and stumbled into what I can only describe as my own living room. My couch sat awkwardly in the middle of the cobblestones, and my TV was propped up against a barrel. The remote lay on the armrest, blinking like it had been waiting for me. About time you showed up, it said. What are you doing here? I asked. Don't look at me, it replied. You're the one hosting this mess. I'm just trying to keep up. As I stood there, a giant, shimmering portal opened up nearby, and a figure stepped through. It was a woman dressed like she just walked out of a Renaissance painting, complete with a corset and a ridiculously large feathered hat. She looked around, her eyes narrowing when she saw me. You, she said, pointing a jeweled dagger in my direction. Are you the host? I guess so, I replied cautiously. Perfect, she said, striding toward me. I'm Lady Fiora of the Starlit Court. Your shuffle is interfering with my territory, and I demand an explanation. I don't even know what's going on, I admitted. She sighed dramatically. Typical. Fine then. I'll settle this myself. She raised her dagger, and for a split second, I thought she was about to attack me, but instead, she slashed at the air, tearing open another portal. Through it, I could see what looked like a glittering ballroom filled with dancing figures. She turned back to me. Fix this before the shuffle collapses. Or don't. Either way, it'll be entertaining. And with that, she vanished. By the time night fell, I had seen enough chaos to fill a lifetime. A battle broke out between the gummy bears and the mushroom folk. My toaster tried to form a union with a sentient kettle it had met on the street. A rogue vending machine began spouting riddles that caused anyone who heard them to float 3 feet in the air. And through it all, the parchment from that morning hovered by my side, now smugly silent, as if to say, this is what you signed up for. So here's my question to you. If worlds started colliding and you were at the center of it, what kind of chaos would you want to see? Or better yet, what would your toaster say? I hadn't been to the old amusement park in years. Not since it had officially shut down and become one of those places people whispered about, haunted, cursed, or off-limits. The kind of spot teenagers dared each other to explore and then posted shaky videos of on social media. But that night, I didn't go there on a dare. I went because I was lost. Literally lost, as in my phone battery died, and my sense of direction is trash. I had taken a long walk to clear my head after a messy breakup. One of those soul-sucking ones where you realize you're not just grieving the person but the future you'd imagine with them. And, as luck would have it, my therapeutic stroll landed me on the outskirts of the abandoned park just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The entrance was still there, rusted and sagging, with the faded letters of its name barely visible. Evermore Park. The gate was open just a crack, as if daring me to step inside. I hesitated, of course. I mean, what kind of person walks into an abandoned amusement park alone at night? But then, somewhere deep in the park, I heard it. Music. Not the eerie kind you'd expect in a place like that. No creepy pipe organs or discordant notes. It was cheerful, lilting, the unmistakable tune of a carousel calliope. The sound was so vivid, so alive, that it felt completely out of place in the decayed emptiness of the park. Before I knew it, my feet were moving toward it, my curiosity overriding any lingering common sense. The path through the park was overgrown with weeds, and the rides loomed like skeletons in the dark. The Ferris wheel was missing half its cars, and the tilt-a-whirl was tilted permanently to one side. Its colors faded to dull gray. But the music grew louder and clearer with every step, and eventually, I saw it. The carousel. It looked untouched by time. Unlike the rest of the park, it was vibrant, every detail meticulously painted and polished. The horses gleamed as though someone had just brushed them down, their manes flowing in frozen motion. Lights twinkled along the edge of the canopy, casting warm, inviting circles on the ground. The whole thing spun slowly, majestically, though I couldn't see anyone operating it. "Don't do it," a voice said behind me, startling me so badly I nearly tripped over my own feet. I spun around to find a boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing a few yards away. He wore a vintage-looking jacket and knickerbockers, like he'd stepped out of a black and white photograph. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide, darting nervously between me and the carousel. "Don't do what?" I asked. "Don't get on. No one ever gets off." I blinked, unsure whether to laugh or back away slowly. "Are you messing with me?" He shook his head solemnly. "It doesn't let you go. Not unless it takes something first." "Okay, kid," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Sure. Thanks for the warning." He didn't respond, just stared at me for a moment longer before turning and sprinting off into the shadows, as silent as he'd appeared. I should have left. I should have taken the weird little boy's cryptic warning and gone straight home. But the music, there was something about it. Something that pulled at me, not just my ears but my entire being. It was a siren song, and before I fully realized what I was doing, I was stepping onto the carousel platform. The moment my foot touched it, the music changed. It slowed, deepened, the cheerful notes morphing into something richer, almost mournful. The lights dimmed slightly, flickering like candle flames in a breeze. My breath hitched, but I couldn't seem to move away. The horses seemed to shift in the corner of my vision, their painted eyes glinting with something that felt too alive. There was one horse in particular that stood out to me, a black stallion with fiery red accents on its bridle and saddle. Its head was thrown back, mouth open in a silent whinny. Without thinking, I reached out and ran my fingers along its glossy mane. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, rich and smooth, with a hint of amusement. I spun around, but there was no one else there. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely. "Why, I am," the voice replied, as if that explained everything. "You've come to ride, haven't you?" I don't think so," I stammered, taking a step back toward the edge of the platform. "Oh, but you've already started," the voice purred. "You touched the horse. The ride has chosen you." The ground beneath me trembled, and suddenly, the carousel wasn't spinning slowly anymore. It lurched into motion, the horses galloping faster and faster, though their hooves remained glued to the platform. The lights strobed wildly, and the music swelled, now layered with voices, singing, crying, laughing. I tried to jump off, but it was like the air around me had solidified, holding me in place. My hands flew to my ears to block out the sound, but it was inside me, vibrating through my chest, my bones, my mind. Images began flashing before my eyes, scenes from my past, my childhood, my happiest and most painful moments, and then even stranger ones. Me in places I didn't recognize, speaking to people I'd never met, living lives that weren't mine but somehow felt familiar. "Do you see it now?" the voice asked, softer this time, almost gentle.
What?
I gasped, tears streaming down my face. "See what?" "The truth. Every choice, every path, every version of you. They all end here. They all come back to me. I don't understand." "You don't have to." Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything stopped. The carousel ground to a halt, the music silenced, and the lights went out. I stumbled off the platform, my knees buckling as I collapsed onto the grass. When I looked back, the carousel was still again, its horses frozen in their painted poses. The park was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain, though the sky was clear. I made my way home in a daze, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination, some bizarre stress-induced episode. But when I emptied my pockets that night, I found something I hadn't put there, a single golden token, engraved with the silhouette of a horse. I still have it. Sometimes, late at night, I hear carousel music in the distance, faint and haunting. And when I do, I swear the token feels warm to the touch, as though it's waiting for me to come back. Have you ever felt like you stumbled into a story that wasn't yours, only to find out you were always meant to be part of it? I once accidentally started a secret society. It wasn't on purpose. I'm not nearly organized enough for that. But somehow it happened. And honestly, it was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. It all began at my local library, which, fun fact, has an enormous basement that smells like damp carpet and forgotten ambitions. I'd been attending this community event called Game Night on Thursdays. It was supposed to be a low-key gathering where people brought board games, played a few rounds of Scrabble, and then went home. Pretty harmless, right? That's what I thought too, until the envelope appeared. It was a regular Thursday. I just finished losing spectacularly at Settlers of Catan. I'm the kind of player who spends all their resources building roads to nowhere. When one of the librarians, this guy named Sam, came over. Sam was tall and thin, with glasses that always looked like they were about to slide off his nose. He handed me a plain manila envelope and said, "This came for you." I frowned. "For me? But I don't even have a library card." Sam shrugged. "Dunno. It was in the drop box with your name on it." Now, most people would have opened it immediately, but I decided to wait until I got home. Why? Because I was raised on movies where mysterious envelopes either explode or contain instructions for a treasure hunt, and I wasn't about to find out which in public. When I finally opened it, there was no explosion, just a single sheet of paper folded neatly in half. In bold, typewriter font, it read, "The night owls meet where knowledge sleeps. Midnight sharp. Do not bring a flashlight." No signature. No further explanation. Just that cryptic message. At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe Sam was messing with me, or maybe someone at game night thought it'd be funny to freak out the new guy. But something about it intrigued me. I mean, where knowledge sleeps? Clearly, that was the library. But why midnight? And why no flashlight? Against my better judgment, I decided to find out. That Friday night, I set an alarm for 11:45 p.m., pulled on my sneakers, and crept out of my apartment like I was sneaking out for a high school party. The streets were eerily quiet as I made my way to the library, its towering facade looming in the moonlight. The front doors were locked, but I'd noticed earlier in the week that the side door never latched properly. I slipped inside, feeling a mix of adrenaline and extreme guilt. The library at night was unsettling. The rows of bookshelves cast long shadows across the carpet, and the air felt heavy, like the building was holding its breath. I made my way to the basement, heart pounding, and there they were. 6 other people, sitting in a loose circle on the floor, illuminated by the faint glow of an old oil lantern. For a moment, I just stood there, unsure what to do. Then a woman with short, spiky hair looked up and said, "You're late." I didn't know if this was real, I stammered. She smirked. "It's real. Sit." So I sat. Nobody introduced themselves, but the group had this weird energy, like they all knew each other without needing to say a word. The guy with the lantern, a middle-aged man in a tweed jacket, opened a battered notebook and cleared his throat. Tonight's agenda, he began, is as follows: the unraveling of the tower mystery, the code from last week's map, and of course, the puzzle box. Puzzle box? Tower mystery? What was this? Before I could ask any questions, the group launched into a heated discussion about something called the Shadow Library. Apparently, there were rumors that the library had a hidden archive filled with banned books, classified documents, and who knows what else. The group, who, I now realized, called themselves the Night Owls, had been meeting for weeks, following obscure clues to uncover its location. And then, as if this wasn't already wild enough, someone pulled out a small wooden box with strange symbols carved into its sides. "We think it's a key," Spiky Hair said, handing it to me. "Try your luck." I stared at the box, half expecting it to bite me, but curiosity got the better of me. I twisted and turned its pieces, aligning the carvings until, click, the lid popped open, revealing a folded scrap of parchment inside. On it was a single line of text: "Beneath the lion's gaze." "Holy crap," Tweed Jacket whispered. "It's real." The group erupted into murmurs, speculating what it meant. I, meanwhile, was sitting there like, what have I gotten myself into? But a strange part of me wanted to see how far this rabbit hole went. The next few weeks were a blur of late-night meetings, cryptic messages, and sneaking around the library like we were in some kind of low-stakes spy movie. We found a statue of a lion in one of the back rooms, and beneath it, a loose floorboard that led to a hidden compartment. Inside were old manuscripts, faded photographs, and a ledger with names I didn't recognize. But here's the kicker. The more we uncovered, the less it felt like the Shadow Library was the point. Instead, it was the process, the late nights, the shared excitement, the bizarre teamwork of solving riddles with strangers. By the time we finally hit a dead end, a locked cabinet we couldn't open without a key that was probably long gone, I didn't even care. I wasn't there for the treasure anymore. I was there for the people. The Night Owls still meet, though now it's less about secret archives and more about playing absurdly competitive trivia games. We've even added a few new members. Sam the librarian eventually joined us, which still feels like cheating somehow. And while the whole experience started with an anonymous envelope, I've realized it was never about the mystery. It was about creating something meaningful with people who, by all accounts, should have just been strangers. So, tell me, what's the weirdest way you've ever found your people? Or have you ever stumbled into something bigger than yourself by complete accident? I'd love to hear about it. I didn't mean to become a prophet to a gaggle of grocery store lobsters, but life is weird like that. It started with me having one of those existential crises you don't see coming. You know, the kind where you're in line at a grocery store holding a single sad item. Mine was a frozen burrito, and the person in front of you has a cart full of kale and kombucha and life goals, and suddenly you're questioning every choice you've ever made. That's where I was. I'd worked late, my fridge was empty, and I was too tired to cook anything resembling real food. Hence, the burrito. The line was long, and my brain, for lack of anything better to do, started spiraling. What was I doing with my life? Why didn't I have a cart full of kale? Was I a failure? Before I could drown myself in a sea of self-doubt, I realized the line hadn't moved in a while. The guy ahead of me was arguing with the cashier about coupons. He had an entire binder of them, which felt like overkill for someone buying 50 cans of creamed corn. Desperate to distract myself, I wandered over to the live seafood tanks near the deli. You know the ones. Cloudy water, some sad seaweed in the corner, and a bunch of lobsters just hanging out, waiting for their inevitable doom. I pressed my face to the glass, feeling both sorry for them and oddly comforted. "Same, buddy," I muttered to one particularly large lobster who seemed to be staring at me with a mix of apathy and disdain. And that's when it happened. I swear, I wasn't imagining it. The lobster wiggled its claw in what can only be described as a judgmental shrug, like it was saying, "Really? You think your life is bad? At least you're not trapped in a tank with Larry over there who won't stop trying to climb on my shell." "Okay," I said aloud, because apparently I was now talking to lobsters in public. "But at least you don't have to explain to your parents why you're still single and living in an apartment with a broken dishwasher." So, the lobster didn't react. Maybe it was thinking. Maybe it was plotting. Or maybe it was just a lobster and I was losing my mind. Either way, I kept talking. "What do you even do all day? Just hang out and wait for someone to decide your dinner? Do you ever feel, I don't know, stuck?" At that point, I became aware of a few things. One, I had been standing there long enough to attract the attention of a small child, who was now tugging on his mom's sleeve and pointing at me like I was the most interesting exhibit in the grocery zoo. Two, I wasn't entirely joking anymore. I did feel stuck, like my life was on a loop and I couldn't break free. And three, the lobster was now raising its claws in what looked an awful lot like victory or defiance. I leaned closer, dropping my voice to a whisper. "What's your secret?" And that's when it hit me. The lobsters were free, in a way I wasn't. Sure, they were stuck in a tank, but they weren't agonizing over their to-do lists or wondering if their ex was happier without them. They didn't care about the future. They were just there, being, existing, even if their existence was tragically short and involved butter sauce. It wasn't exactly enlightenment, but it was close. I stood there for another minute, staring at them, and then I did something I still can't fully explain. I went to the deli counter and asked the guy behind it if I could buy one of the lobsters, but not to eat it. "I just want to, set it free." The deli guy didn't even blink. "You'd be surprised how often people say that," he said, scooping the big one, the one I'd been talking to, into a plastic bag with some water. I paid for the lobster, which I now felt weirdly responsible for, like I'd adopted a surly sea creature child. The cashier didn't say anything as I handed over the burrito and the lobster like that was a perfectly normal combination, but I could feel her judging me. Whatever. I didn't care. I had a lobster to liberate. I drove to the nearest beach, which was about 30 minutes away, with the lobster riding shotgun in its bag. "I'm naming you Claude," I told it. "Get it? Because you have claws." Claude didn't respond, which I took as either silent approval or utter indifference. When we got to the beach, the sun was setting, casting the sky in these ridiculous shades of pink and orange that made me feel small in the best way. I waded into the water, holding Claude's bag like it was some precious artifact, and then, with as much ceremony as I could muster, I opened it and tipped him into the waves. He didn't hesitate. He just paddled away, disappearing into the depths without so much as a goodbye. I stood there for a while, letting the cold water lap at my legs and watching the horizon. I didn't feel unstuck, exactly, but I felt lighter. Like maybe I didn't have to figure everything out right away. Like maybe it was okay to just be, even if that meant hanging out in the proverbial tank for a while. When I got back to my car, there was a note under the windshield wiper. For a second, I thought it was a parking ticket, but it wasn't. It was a scrap of paper with handwriting so messy, it looked like it had been scribbled in a hurry. It said, "Thanks for the reminder, Claude." I laughed all the way home. Do you ever have moments like that? Where something so absurdly random happens, it shakes you out of your own head and makes you feel like the universe is in on the joke? Or am I the only one taking life advice from seafood? It started with a puddle, just an ordinary, rain-soaked puddle on the edge of the sidewalk. I wasn't paying much attention as I stepped over it, but the shimmer of a rainbow on its surface caught my eye. Something about the way the light danced across the water gave me pause. I crouched down, balancing awkwardly with my coffee cup, and saw it more clearly. A perfect reflection of the sky above, pale gray clouds softened by the late afternoon light. But that wasn't what stopped me. It was the way the ripples looked like they were pulling me in, as if I could step right through the surface and find myself somewhere else entirely. It was stupid, I knew. It was just a puddle, not a portal to another world. But for a moment, it didn't feel like reality could be trusted. I leaned closer, staring into the water, and for some reason, I remembered a field. Not a specific field, Just the general feeling of being 8 years old and running barefoot through tall grass, my legs itching with mosquito bites and my lungs burning in that wonderful, reckless way that only kids ever really experience. I could almost smell it, the sweetness of wildflowers mixed with the sharp tang of grass after a summer rain. It was so vivid it startled me. Someone brushed past me, muttering a quick apology, and I snapped back to reality. Embarrassed, I straightened up, clutching my coffee like a lifeline, and tried to brush the memory away. But it lingered, stubborn and warm, like the ghost of a song stuck in my head. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about that field. The memory wasn't tied to anything obvious. No particular event, no person. But it felt deeply important, like I'd unlocked a drawer in my brain that hadn't been opened in years. I found myself wandering through the apartment, restless, until I stumbled upon an old shoebox shoved under my bed. I knew exactly what was inside before I even opened it, but when I pulled off the lid, it still hit me like a wave. Marbles. There must have been 50 of them, maybe more, rolling around in a tangle of dust and mismatched rubber bands. Some were chipped, their once glossy surfaces dulled by time, but they were still beautiful. Swirls of blues and greens that looked like frozen galaxies, tiny worlds caught in glass. I picked one up, holding it between my fingers, and in an instant, I was back on my grandmother's porch. Her porch had this creaky wooden floor that seemed to groan in protest whenever you stepped on it. But to me, it was a kingdom. On lazy summer afternoons, I'd sit there for hours, my legs crossed, my hands clutching those marbles as if they were treasure. I didn't even play the game right. I made up my own rules, building elaborate stories where each marble had a personality. The clear ones were the good guys, brave and kind, while the dark, smoky ones were the villains, always plotting some devious scheme. I'd roll them across the floor, narrating battles and alliances, completely lost in my tiny, self-contained universe. Sometimes my grandma would watch from her rocking chair, smiling in that quiet way of hers, her knitting needles clicking softly in the background. I held that marble in my hand for what felt like forever, marveling at how much power such a small object could hold. It wasn't just a piece of glass. It was a key, a tiny, perfect reminder of who I used to be. I dug through the box, pulling out one marble after another, each one dragging a new memory to the surface. The green one with the golden streaks? That was the one I used to defeat the imaginary dragon in the garden. The oversized blue one? That was my queen, the marble I always saved for special occasions. Every single one had a story, and I could feel myself slipping into that old, childlike mindset, where anything was possible and nothing was too small to be magical. I don't know how long I sat there, turning those marbles over in my hands, but at some point, I realized I was crying. Not the loud, ugly kind of crying, just a quiet, steady stream of tears that I didn't even notice until they started dripping onto the marbles. I wasn't sad, though. If anything, I felt grateful. Grateful that those memories hadn't been lost, that they were still there, waiting for me to find them. The next day, I took the marbles with me to the park. I must have looked ridiculous, a grown adult sitting cross-legged on the grass, rolling marbles around like some kind of amateur archaeologist, but I didn't care. The sun was warm on my face, the grass was soft under my hands, and for the first time in years, I felt light, free, a kid again. I even made up a little game for myself, rolling the marbles down the slope of a small hill, watching them bounce and spin in unpredictable patterns. A couple of kids wandered over to watch, their faces curious and a little confused. One of them, a boy with a mop of curly hair, asked, "What are you doing?" "Just playing," I said, smiling. He looked skeptical at first, but then he sat down beside me, pulling a shiny green marble from his pocket. He didn't say where he'd gotten it, and I didn't ask. We just played, rolling the marbles back and forth, inventing stories about knights and castles and magical forests. For a little while, the world shrank down to the size of those tiny, spinning galaxies. When I finally got home that evening, my box of marbles was lighter than before. Some had rolled off into the grass, and I didn't bother chasing after them. It felt right to leave them there, like I was leaving pieces of myself for someone else to find. And maybe, Someday, they'd stumble across a random puddle, or an old box, or a dusty marble tucked away in the corner of a park, and they'd feel it, too, that tiny, breathtaking spark of memory. What's the strangest, smallest thing that's ever pulled you back into a forgotten moment?